Hello, and welcome back. This is your first time here. I suggest you watch the part 1, since that's where I started with the 1700 serial killers and kind of leading up to where we are now. If you have been here before, then you normally know how this goes. Instead of just it being me, though, I have these wonderful people and their beautiful voices to help me out. And without them, I would not have been able to make this video 3 hours long. Watch the video. Go watch their channels. Of course, this isn't going to be the entirety of the video. I do have a part 3, but that'll be out probably in a few more months. If you liked the video, please hit that like button and remember to subscribe, and I will see you guys later. Peace.
Lloyed Gomez. Lloyd was born in 1923 in Nevada to Indian native parents. Unfortunately, when he was very young, his mother died, leaving his father to take care of him. In 1939, he had fled home, having no formal education. He traveled through a lot of the Southwest, and he did this by getting on freight trains. For some reason, later in life, he went under the pen name Harry Jenkins. At this time, he went in and out of jail for assault charges and dodging the draft, which was a big crime at the time, and even threatened a kid for his gun while he was armed with a knife. Though the last time he was in jail, he simply walked off when the guards weren't looking, and he was never seen again for 2 years. Gomez became more and more motivated by financial gain, eventually causing him to begin robbing and killing people. Gomez chose fellow homeless men as his victims. Why he killed homeless people, I'm not sure. The first was an unidentified man who was killed in the summer of 1950. The cause of death being a wine bottle smashed against his head. The next victim was Warren Cunningham, a 42-year-old man who was shot to death after Gomez assumed he had stolen his beer. 8 days after that murder, Gomez ended up in Mojave, and while he was there, murdered 53-year-old Earl Franklin by bashing his head with a rock. He disposed of the gun he had used to kill Warren and Earl's body in the same place and fled to LA. He was arrested by authorities, not for the murder of 3 homeless people, it was for vagrancy. Apparently that's a law saying that you can't be homeless, where he spent 30 days and was released. About 5 months later, he decided to resume his killing spree, and this time claiming 6 more victims. As the bodies were being found, law enforcement was contacted, and they knew a serial killer was responsible. Though numbers varied on the number of cases, police believed the killer committed as much as 12 murders. Throughout the entire trial, he had pleaded he had done nothing wrong, and all of the acts were self-defense. The prosecution knew they could get him for at least 1 murder, and have undisputable evidence to back it up. He was charged with murder of Warren, and was sentenced to death. Joseph Taborsky, or Mad Dog. Joseph was born in 1924, and as it goes for the usual serial killers around here, his early life is really unknown. Most of what I could find is that he had 2 younger brothers who he was a terrible influence on, and he actually took one of his brothers to an early robbery to help him. Anyways, something well known about Joseph is that he is the only convict to ever be given the death penalty more than once. How does that happen? Well, in 1950, he murdered Louise Wolfson, a West Hartford liquor store owner, during a robbery. His younger brother, Albert, who was his co-conspirator, testified against him at the trial in exchange for a life sentence. When he was in prison, Albert exhibited signs of mental illness, and he was institutionalized. He had learned through the prison grapevine that his brother, the guy who testified against him, ended up in a sane asylum in 1955. The corrections judges took away Joseph's death penalty because the key witness was criminally insane. He was even released and even stated, "You can't beat the law. From now on, I'm not even going to get a parking ticket." Once he was released, he came across another previous convict named Harvey Colli, or Meatball was his street name. They attempted to rob a grocery store where Joseph would be at a 3-year-old girl's house whose parents weren't conscious. Joseph ordered Meatball to kill the girl, but he instead hit her behind a table and shot a fake shot at the ground. The two were caught because Meatball spared this girl, and she immediately told the police what they had done. Because Meatball spared the girl, he just got life in prison. Joseph, however, wasn't so lucky. He was given a spot immediately in the electric chair, being the last person to be electrocuted by Mr. Sparky.
Lester Harrison. Born in Chicago in the year 1922, Lester had several siblings, both older and younger. And as early as age 9 or 10, Lester had began committing petty crimes. And it was these crimes that led Lester to take on more risk for a bigger reward. And around 1945, he was arrested and convicted of robbery, ultimately being sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison. And while serving this aforementioned sentence at the Menard State Penitentiary, Lester had murdered a fellow inmate, 28-year-old Norman Kim, by striking him over the head with an iron rod. Although admitting guilt and being tried for the crime, the medical examination found Lester to be insane at the time of the trial. So instead of being sent to prison, he was instead put into psychiatric treatment at the Security Hospital. After spending some time in this facility, Lester was released and deemed cured due to positive psychiatric reports. But upon release, Harrison continued his criminal lifestyle, garnering a total of 8 additional arrests between the late 1950s and early 70s. One of the most horrific crimes, taking place on the evening of June 19th, 1970, when a homeless woman living in the Skid Row area of Chicago was found raped and beaten to death. On this same night, a 31-year-old factory worker was found beaten unconscious. This man was named Wilbur McDonald. And when the police were investigating this crime scene, they named Wilbur the prime suspect, due to his shoes being found close to the crime scene. And through nothing other than circumstantial evidence, Wilbur was convicted of this murder and received a 150-year sentence. However, following this incident, years later in the evening of July 19th, 1972, an English architect was found murdered and raped in a park as well. And while narrowly avoiding the law for the time being, Harrison's luck had eventually ran out when he was arrested for assaulting a woman with a concrete brick in the streets of Chicago, though later was released due to a $5,000 bail being set. And 10 days after this release, a drunken Harrison headed to Grant Park in search of his next victim, settling for a 28-year-old woman who was visiting from Seattle, Washington. The location of this attack? A public washroom, during which he attempted to rape the woman. However, she was able to resist Lester, and through a barrage of violent screams was able to catch the attention of her husband and child, who had been waiting near the bathroom. Her husband rushed to her aid, but due to several stab wounds suffered in the attack from Harrison, this woman had ultimately been pronounced dead. Harrison made an attempt to escape this scene, but after being spotted with a knife in hand, the woman's husband and multiple park employees managed to apprehend him before escaping. And while being transported, he had actually admitted to all of these crimes, stating details only the perpetrator could have known. However, despite these admissions of guilt for several horrible crimes, Lester Harrison was deemed incapable of standing for trial, yet again for the deemed reason of insanity. From here, Lester was sent to receive psychiatric treatment at the State Penitentiary Psychiatric Ward. And years later, in January of 1986, due to complications from a spinal injury, was diagnosed with a damaged spinal cord. something that had left him almost completely immobilized. And with this in mind, his attorneys petitioned for his release in May of that year, stating that Harrison no longer posed a threat to society. But this was shot down by the Cook County Prosecutor's Office, as they had stated that with the remaining movements of his hands and fingers, Harrison was still capable of the unthinkable. And this is essentially the last that we would hear of Harrison. Despite the fact that his crimes had been the centerpiece of many publications, information regarding his fate is widely unknown to the public.
John Roche. John was born in September of 1927 and had two other siblings. Once he was born, his family decided to move to New York. In his youth, he was an extremely troubled child and was even charged with armed robbery at the age of 13. It's unknown who his first exact murder victim is, though he is suspected of murdering 23-year-old Josephine Brown, who was strangled to death and left on the street of Queens. In August of that following year, a sailor named Edward was found stabbed to death in the streets of Queens, much like Brown was. John was later robbing a place, and when the homeowner, an 85-year-old woman, came home, she was stabbed to death before John fled the place. This murder was Roche's first confirmed, though the other two murderers were pinned on some other men. During his trial, there were two different mistrials considering that two men were improperly prisoned. It was only about a year after his last murder that he would be tried and killed by the electric chair. Norman Roy. Norman was born in September of 1935 and had been troubled since his youth. The only thing he liked was baseball. However, later in life, he would commit petty crimes and eventually murder. In 1954, Norman saw a 40-year-old woman named Margaret walking alone, so he decided to follow her to her room, where he choked her and killed her and decided to leave her there. Around 4 months later, Norman found himself in a subway station where he stalked a 25-year-old girl named Kathleen all the way back to her apartment. While in the parking lot, he threatened her with a knife, and he didn't actually have one. He then raped her twice, tied her hands behind her back, then killed her by strangulation. Another year went by, and he came across a 6-year-old woman named Isadora. Norman threw a noose around her neck and demanded money. Isadora only had 5 pennies, and with Norman unsatisfied, he tightened the noose and killed her. Norman bought a box of crackers, which he ate while watching the police examine Isadora's body. Detectives took notice of this and arrested him. Norman confessed to each of these murders by describing in detail how he killed them. On February 4th, 1955, Norman was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Isadora. Not the other two, though. In 1956, he was electrocuted by the chair. Harvey Collins. Harvey was born in October of 1925 in Oregon and had 2 siblings. Once he was 4 or 5, his family moved to Washington, and according to his sister, they lived a very normal lifestyle. When he grew older, he enlisted in the Marine Corps and fought in Battle of Iwo Jima. Once he had returned, though, he had began to exhibit signs of psychological distress, possibly brought on either from PTSD or the death of his father in a workplace accident years prior. In 1953, he offered a waitress a ride home from her job. She accepted, though Harvey decided to drive on a desolate road and tried to make sexual advances towards her. Once she declined, this enraged Harvey, so he literally kicked her out of the car and then proceeded to beat her to death. This was Harvey's first crime, but acted as if he was on the run. Months later, he successfully stole a small plane, left a suicide note, and flew aimlessly for hours, until he crashed the plane near some train tracks, but survived. 2 days later, he surrendered to the police. Though only admitted to stealing the plane and not the murder, instead of serving any jail time, he pretty much got a slap on the wrist and was allowed to go. Though, in the mid-50s, while at a filing station, he shot and killed 25-year-old Edward in an apparent holdup. In March of that same year, he had went to a motel in Hilton. He asked the hostess how much it would be for a night's stay, and when he had heard the price, he left, came back 2 hours later, and attacked her. During this attack, she screamed and awoke her husband. Harvey pulled out a katana and sliced the husband and the hostess, then fled. Harvey took his car and attempted to run her over. However, she dodged him and ran towards the freeway. Harvey was later caught from the description she gave police. Shortly after this arrest, he admitted to the last 2 crimes, however, heavily disputed the first one, the one with the waitress. Though he had some good lawyers, he was found guilty and was given the death penalty. On September 18th, Harvey and 5 other inmates escaped from jail, and he actually sought out refuge from a childhood friend who he had stayed with there for 2 days. After this, he brought himself in, and police actually made his death date to December 1957. He was hanged at the Washington State Penitentiary. Mack Edwards. Mack was born in Arkansas in 1918 and moved to LA at an early age. In 1942, Mack joined the United States Marine Corps of Engineers. He married a woman in 1946, in which they relocated to California. He kept horses and allowed neighborhood youths to ride them. He also took local children camping. Edwards sexually molested and murdered 3 children from 1953 to 1956, though the records are scarce. The first 3 children he murdered were all neighbors of his. He molested and murdered 3 more in 1968 to 1969, though these records are entirely more scarce. After attempting to kidnap 3 girls at once, 2 of them escaped, so he ended up letting the 3rd one go. Figuring the police would be soon after him, he walked into San Fernando Valley Police Station on March 6, 1970 and surrendered to the police. He confessed that he had planned to molest and kill the 3 girls, and confessed to having murdered the 6 others. Anyways, after 3 of the bodies were found, he stood for trial without a lawyer because all he said was that he was guilty and he wanted death, even switching places with the next person who was up for the electric chair. After months of trial, Edwards committed suicide by hanging himself with the electrical television cord in San Quentin State Prison. Leslie Irvin. Leslie was born in 1924, and one of the first killers on our list to have actually gone on a killing spree, if you will. Irvin was ultimately arrested in connections with 6 murders that were committed in 4 separate incidents. This killing spree began on December 2nd, 1954, and ended on March 28, 1955. The crimes took place in Vanderburgh and Posey counties in Indiana and Henderson County in Kentucky. He would usually use a gun and shoot his victims, though he had a tendency to burglarize them as well. Though, at this last burglary, his car was seen by key witnesses and led to his arrest later. Weapons and some loot that tied to him with one of the murders were found. While in jail, awaiting trial, he MacGyvered his way out of jail and did this by making keys with paperback novel covers, tinfoil, and glue. He fled to the west but was later apprehended. Ironically, the laws around the death penalty around this time were just starting to be loosened, so he was sentenced to life. He died in 1983 of lung cancer in the state penitentiary. Vender Duncan. Vender was born in 1928 in the state of Texas at the age of 17. He lost his left eye not long after he served a sentence for attempted murder for stabbing a man 24 times but not killing him. After serving the time, he met a woman and they moved towards San Francisco. He became a painter, though when he wasn't making enough money, he decided to start robbing houses, frequently preying upon dwellings inhabited by the elderly women and sometimes molesting them. During his first screw-up, he was on a second-story window and saw 89-year-old Marceline counting her money. He entered through her window and attempted to attack her on the head. He committed necrophilia with her body and took the money, and when he was making his escape, dropped a small desk radio at the scene. On September 4th of that same year, he stumbled upon another small apartment, opened up another person's window, and 75-year-old Elizabeth was there. He raided her house, didn't steal anything, and left. 2 years later, Vender was in a vacant lot with an elderly woman who was 68. He decided to grab a brick and throw it at her head. After she died, he carried her body to a nearby street to be left there for the police to find. Just 3 days after this attack, Duncan had struck again, this time going to a second-story apartment and knocking on a random door. He barged his way in and found a 73-year-old woman named Angst and attempted to beat her. He knocked her down and dragged her to the bathroom. However, Angst told him that the police were nearby, so at that point he decided to flee. It was the description that she had given to police that eventually led to this arrest. Not long after, Duncan was caught while attempting to burglarize another house, and he was convicted and sent to jail. Though 3 months into his sentence, he called the county sheriff and confessed to the 3 previous crimes. In 1958, his trial for the 3 murders began. Though he tried to claim he was insane, that didn't work. He was given a death sentence. He was executed by gas chamber in 1959. Melvin Rees. Melvin was born in 1928 in Maryland. Not much is known about his early life, though he was a very skilled musician in school, though that is the only plus side to Melvin, as in 1957 he came across Margaret Harold and her boyfriend while they were in their car. Melvin approached in the Chrysler and swerved them off the road. Melvin exited his vehicle and demanded the 2 money and to roll down their window. They decided not to, and Melvin shot Margaret in the face, killing her instantly. Her boyfriend of a Marine fled and ran through a couple of fields until he got to a farmhouse where he called the police. When the police arrived, they found that her clothes had been taken off her and she was molested. Melvin decided to lay low for 2 years, got a job as a lineman worker, and was chill until he decided to strike again, this time murdering an entire family. Carol Jackson and his wife Mildred and their infant children were all found slain and bodies being disposed of in a nearby forest. This crime didn't go unnoticed for long because the family was a regular happy family. This was when the crime became media sensation. The only reason he got caught was that someone by the name of Glenn Morsner sent into police that they should investigate Melvin because of the same type of car that was found on the scene Melvin owned. This guy knew Rees on a personal level, but records didn't show exactly how. In 1960, Rees was ultimately arrested, and after searching his home, police found notes describing the Jackson family murders. Unfortunately, his crime was tried in Virginia, where the death penalty had been outlawed, and he was sentenced to life in prison, though he would later be sent to an institution where he would die.
Nathaniel Lipscomb. Nathaniel was born in 1929 in South Carolina. At a young age, Nathaniel would be caught repeatedly peeping on women dressing in their homes. His second offense would involve him stealing a bike, which he would serve low jail time. In 1951, police received a call that a murder had taken place. The caller had said that her granddaughter, 4-year-old Diane Maxwell, whose head was cut and bloodied, told her that a man had burgled into their home and cut her mother. When the police got there, Miss Maxwell was lying on the floor in a pool of her own blood. Lipscomb was arrested and even took a lie detector test, where he would eventually be released and remained under the radar. Until Baltimore was struck with a series of killings. The first being a woman named May Hall, being found in a nearby stranger's yard, strangled to death. 5 days later, 57-year-old Lottie Kite, who was a nurse, went out to sweep in front of her hall, and 2 hours later, she was found dead in an alleyway. After these killings, Nathaniel knew that he had to lay low. which he did until April the following year, when he'd kill his last victim. He'd do this only 5 blocks away from where he murdered Lottie. The following morning, the police were going through the streets of Baltimore when they heard a woman screaming. Upon finding her, they found Nathaniel in an alleyway. He was arrested and questioned. Once Nathaniel gave his name, the police looked into his background, and they agreed that he probably got their man. He was tried and found guilty of all 3 crimes, and Nathaniel Lipscomb was executed in the Maryland State Penitentiary's gas chamber.
Glenn Engelman, our first optometrist. Glenn was born in 1927. He was born the youngest of 4 children. His father was a member of the United States Air Force and was raised in a high middle-class home. He was genuinely smart and graduated at the University of St. Louis in dentistry. In 1958, James Bullock, 27, a clerk for Union Electric Company, was shot in St. Louis Art Museum, though Glenn confessed to this crime much later. In 1963, Glenn had a business partner named Eric Frey, whom he at one point struck with a rock and blew him up with dynamite to hide the evidence. He did this because Eric's insurance would go to Glenn. Glenn would kill 5 more people in a similar manner, except not blowing them up. For his final murder, he decided to make a car bomb and kill a woman that he owed a large amount of money to, named Barbara. It was this murder on September 25th. A jury in federal court found Engelman guilty of mail fraud and conspiracy to commit mail fraud in the murder of Barbara. He died in an infirmary in 1999. Lemanuel Smith. This dude just sucks. Lemanuel was born in a very religious household in 1941 in New York. In 1958, near the end of January, Dorothy Water Street was robbed and beaten to death near Smith's home in Amsterdam. Evidence pointed toward the 16-year-old Smith, but the case fell apart when the district attorney was too hasty to extract a confession, and Smith was not arrested. That following summer, Smith went to Amsterdam where he would kidnap a 25-year-old woman and almost beat her to death. This time, a witness interrupted the crime, and Smith left a living victim. He was quickly arrested and on April 12, 1959, was sentenced to 20 years in prison for assault. After 10 years, he was released on parole, but exactly a year after he attempted to kidnap another woman, but she escaped and didn't tell anyone about the crime. Later that same day, he kidnapped and raped a 46-year-old friend of his mother's. She told him if he left, she would not call the police. He left, and as soon as she heard the door close, she notified the police. He was later caught and arrested again, and was eventually sentenced to 4 to 15 years in a New York prison. This time, he had only spent 4 years and was released again. Why? A legit month afterward, 2 people were found brutally murdered. Human feces were found 50 feet nearby, and it had happened to be Smith's. When the police were investigating the murder, another murder about 30 minutes away had taken place, and happened in the exact same way. It only took 2 weeks to be on the trial of Smith. Maureen Maggio, 18, who worked in the same area as Wilson, was kidnapped and raped by Smith. When he forced her to drive towards Albany afterwards, police stopped the car and arrested Smith without incident. He was tried, and he really tried to get insanity plea, but that failed, and he was sent to prison. There, he would kill a man named Peyton. As punishment for the Peyton murder, and due to the threat he posed while in prison, Smith spent the next 20 years of his life in near isolation, the longest such span in the nation at the time. As of December 2022, is still alive at a maximum security prison.
Richard Biegenwald. Richard was born in Staten Island, and his youth life seemed to be largely unknown. But what we do know is that he was beaten by his father, and when he was just 5, would set his own house on fire, though we were not here for that. In 1958, Richard would rob a store and murder a stone owner. For this, he would receive 17 years in prison. He would be released in 1975, where he would strike again when he shot and killed an 18-year-old girl named Anna Alzawek. Her body was found in January 1983 by children playing in a wooden lot behind a Burger King. I also forgot to mention, he also had another shootout where he killed a police officer before. I don't know how I forgot about that. Anyways, police surrounded Richard's house in 1983, where they would lure him out and arrest him. He was convicted of 5 different counts of murder, though 2 of them were when he was still in prison. Big and Wild would rot inside of prison until his own death on March 10th, 2008.
Gano Smith. Smith had an odd youth, though only thing to note is that his parents were divorced and at one point he began living with his stepmother. This is where he would kill 6 of his family members, calculated and planned. He moved in with his stepmother, who was part of the Macbeth family. They took Gano in, and things instantly turned for the worst. Smith had taken the Macbeth children, Amos, Anna, Donna, Jean, and Patsy, to a dance in Brighton. While there, Smith had left for a short amount of time and returned at 12 o'clock midnight to pick them up. However, a thunderstorm was sweeping the area at the time, giving it a dark ambiance. They returned to the home, and Gano reportedly ran up the stairs as the children entered the garage. Upon arrival, they made 2 discoveries. The bodies of their parents were on the ground, with 2 bullet holes in each of them, and there was no power coming throughout the house, and it was entirely dark. The kids found flashlights and made their way through the house. Suddenly, Smith appeared before them with a flashlight and a gun. He shot Amos in the face, then Donna. He shot Patsy in the shoulder, though badly wounded. Amos pleaded for his life, but was shot again. Patsy escaped to another room where she found her older sister, Anna, already dead. Patsy was the only one to escape and speak on that event that even occurred. Gano had went into hiding, but was found 4 days later in a barn near Lake Wakapello. A death sentence was largely discussed, however, Smith was given a little leadway and spent life in prison. Gano died from heart problems on May 16, 2005.
Gary Rawdon. This is going to be our first murderer who's still alive and has actually been released. Gary was born in 1943 in North Carolina and actually stated himself had the perfect family. In 1962, he came across a 23-year-old named James on a boat ride. When it was just the 2 of them, Gary shot him in the back of his head and stuffed his body somewhere on the boat. His body would be found 12 days later, and Gary was charged, but he would claim self-defense and that James was attempting to sexually assault him. In 1963, Rawdon was pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to only 2 to 21 years in prison. He was released on parole on May 8, 1967. In 1969, he ended up spending 3 years in a prison for a robbery. After spending some prison time, he married a woman and was working as a mechanist. But he quickly got bored, quitting his job and leaving his wife. He came across a shotgun and set off the barrel. Rawdon would proceed to kill 3 men in Chicago with a sawed-off shotgun as he was robbing them. The police would use credit card tracing through one of the victims' cards that Gary was found using, which they eventually found him at a Sears with items from each of the murders. Immediately, he would confess to the crimes. He was transferred from prison from time to time. However, he was released in 2020. Rawdon served nearly 50 years in prison for the murders. He is currently out and still alive.
Stephen Washington. Stephen was born in Florida in 1948. Little is known about his upbringing. However, in 1963, he married a 15-year-old due to Florida's marriage laws, and he had a daughter with her. Later that year, Washington would attack a 52-year-old woman during a home invasion. He assaulted her, but decided not to kill her. He did this 2 more times until he would eventually commit his first murder. On September 25th, 1963, he would invade another home, this one owned by a 75-year-old woman. This time, he would assault her and straight up murder her via strangulation. This not only killed her, but broke one of her neck bones. In October, Washington would strangle 67-year-old Olivia. Authorities were able to correlate the last 2 murders and knew it had to be from the same person. 2 months later, Washington entered the home of 80-year-old Eva Miller by climbing through an open window, and he did the exact same thing he had done prior. Washington would later be caught due to the police finding his fingerprint on the windows he had climbed through. He was arrested in early January 1964. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences because of the crimes, and on March 18, 2004, Washington would die at the age of 55.
Stanley Rice. Rice was born in 1942 in Massachusetts and had 2 older brothers. He grew up in a dysfunctional home. Rice, at a young age, would steal from his fellow family members and had a problem with loud sounds. His father would shoot a gun in his presence to try and fix this issue. At the same time, he continued to commit various acts of vandalism and thefts, receiving his first court date at the age of 11 for stealing ammo. Fast forward to 1957, his family would move to Canada. During this period, he developed a fascination with rockets and bombs and would continue to get in trouble with law enforcement for a variety of crimes. In 1963, a 9-year-old boy went missing from his home in Canada. His disappearance led to a large-scale invasion of the nearby area by both local authorities and volunteers. The only confession we have is that Rice wrote in his diary he came across the 9-year-old boy while he was fishing and stabbed him to death. Later that September, Rice was arrested for abducting a young boy, driving him to Illinois, but the Canadian police agreed that if he left the country, the charges would be dropped. Why? Who knows? Rice moved to Ohio, where in 1966, an 8-year-old boy went out on his bike to go fishing when he came across Rice. Rice proceeded to beat the boy before pulling out a shotgun and shooting him in the chest. He then simply covered the boy's body with pieces of wood and left. The boy's body was found the following day, and Rice was apparently even questioned about the crime, but no evidence was linked to him. He was subsequently arrested 2 weeks later for holding 2 boys at gunpoint. He was sent to a mental hospital, which he was able to escape from just a few months later. He arrived to Florida and he met a 59-year-old woman who let him watch over her salvage yard, and he would be able to sleep in the truck at night. So one morning, after he got off work and was heading home, he stopped near a road that he knew some young children lived on. To lay low, there he found 11-year-old Lowell Nelson and Williams and 10-year-old Kevin Polittle, who were out fishing together. Rice offered to take them somewhere, but they both said no. Angered by this, he pulled out a shotgun and shot them both, wounding them. He pulled out a knife and came up to one of them and stabbed one of them 3 times as he went to the other. 2 teenage boys appeared, so he took his items and then left. On May 25th of that year, Rice was arrested for speeding. Upon his arrest, there was evidence from all 3 previous crimes. He was tried and convicted on all 3 counts. He was transferred to Florida State Prison, where he remained until his death on November 3rd, 2007.
Thomas Wisenhart. Thomas was born January 29, 1947 in Pritchard, Alabama. Growing up in a low-income, abusive household that was primarily ruled by his mother, Thomas, being the youngest of 4 children, witnessed his mother frequently attacking Thomas's alcoholic father, both verbally and physically, who had as well encouraged her children to do the same, reserving her rage solely for the husband, and treating Thomas as the favorite. Wisenhart shared a bedroom with his mother until the age of 16. Being constantly accompanied by her throughout his teenage years, essentially never leaving her sight. Although Thomas had stated that he always resented his mother, within his teenage years, according to his sister, Thomas began showing signs of extreme violence and clear emotional distress. And that became evident to the public when in 1963, a 73-year-old woman was found dead in a parking lot near Thomas's childhood home. Initially, he was held as one of the main suspects in this case, as prior to this incident, Thomas had been charged with robbing a blind woman. A charge that had later been thrown out of court on a technicality. According to police, when questioning Wisenhart, the family was able to provide him with a solid enough alibi that Wisenhart was never brought to trial for the murder of this woman. Despite prior to this shooting, Thomas and his friends had been seen playing with a stolen handgun. And following this close run-in with the law, Thomas had decided to clean up his act and join the United States Air Force as an airman. But while stationed at a base near Colorado Springs, Thomas's true nature showed itself to the world. When, on October 25th, 1995, Wisenhart had attacked 22-year-old Rose Covington, striking her over the head with a metal ashtray several times, causing Covington to suffer severe head and facial injuries that left her hospitalized for 2 months. At the trial, she testified that she had never met him prior to this incident, nor did she have any idea who he was. But the most damning piece of evidence that linked Thomas to this came from an FBI lab expert, testifying that the shoe prints left at the scene of the crime matched the exact ones of those that Thomas had been wearing. Although claiming innocence all along, Thomas was convicted of assault with intent to commit murder on March 14, 1966, and sentenced to 20 years in prison with hard labor. However, following this, in 1970, this sentence was reduced to 10 years, and on November 1973, Thomas had been granted parole. A decision that would be filled with regret, as only 2 years later, on November 21, 1975, Wisenhart attacked a 28-year-old woman, a mother of two who worked in a convenience store, approaching her, beating her, and ultimately fatally shooting her in the head. Initially, 2 men were arrested for this crime, leaving Wisenhart to continue his rampage. The next time he would strike was on April 16, 1976. Wisenhart had kidnapped and murdered another female convenience store clerk, dumping her body near an abandoned shack. But the killings wouldn't stop here. On October 16, 1976, Wisenhart abducted a 23-year-old woman, once again a convenience store clerk, kidnapping her at gunpoint, driving her to a wooded remote area, where he had ultimately shot yet another woman in the head, dragging her body into the nearby woods before fleeing the scene. Wisenhart had a messy history of returning to the scene of his crimes. And when returning to get rid of the evidence of this horrible crime, Wisenhart had been spotted at the location of the murder, and after giving chase was captured by police. Despite pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, on August 9th, the jury found Thomas guilty of capital murder, and on September 7th, 1977, was sentenced to death. While avoiding execution for more than 3 decades due to successful appeals and prosecution errors, on May 27, 2010, Wisenhart was executed via lethal injection at the Holman Correctional Facility near Atmore, Alabama.
Rudy Bladel. Rudy was born in 1932 in Chicago, Illinois, to a family that was in the business of railways. His father worked for a railway company, stationed in Chicago. After graduating high school in 1951, Rudy became a fireman and later enlisted in the Army, where he became an engineer and served in the Korean War, whereas he fixed vehicles, sometimes encountering enemy soldiers. When Rudy returned home from the war, he got into a motorcycle accident that gave him a permanent posture issue. He worked for the same company as his father. However, the New York Railroad shifted operations away from the Chicago area, which laid off many people, including Rudy. Rudy began targeting railroad workers who were associated with them that moved away from the Chicago area. Between 1963 and 1978, Rudy murdered 7 railroad workers and critically injured 1 in multiple states. His last killing was a triple murder, a gun shop owner owned by one of the railroad in Jackson, Mississippi. He was eventually arrested for the triple homicide and convicted. However, the Supreme Court ruled that Rudy's case must be retired. The jury found Rudy guilty for a second time, though he was not convicted for the other murders. Rudy died in 2006 from thyroid cancer. James Daniels. James was born in 1940 in Brooklyn, New York. He was first arrested in early 1960 for assaulting a man in Queens with a zip gun. This landed him 2 years in prison. He was then charged with second-degree murder for a man named Calvin, who was running a craps game. He was given 50 to life sentence for this, and while here, he served only 16 years of this sentence. And due to the new state law that was discussed earlier, maximum penalties were released. He was moved to Oregon to change his life, and there he had a wife and a daughter. But unfortunately, this would all come to an end when, in 1984, he would commit a double murder within hours of each other. The first being to steal a truck to make a getaway, and the second being just randomly done. His third and final murder would be the result of shooting a trooper who assumed he just had car trouble. He was in a getaway van being chased by 2 police officers. The van unfortunately swerved out of control and crashed into a high-tension utility pole and plunged down an embankment and overturned, and he died.
Harvey Marcelin. This is a weird one. Born in 1938 as a male, Harvey Marcelin in New York City was born to a single mother. At 14, Harvey tried to rape an 8-year-old girl. By 1963, Harvey was an alcoholic and a cocaine addict who was accused of raping his then girlfriend Jacqueline Bonds. Before he could stand trial, he murdered Bonds, convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but was released in 1984. The next year, Harvey murdered Anna Sierra, a homeless heroin addict. He dismembered her body and dumped the remains in Central Park. He was again charged with murder, but struck a plea deal and was sent to prison again in 1986. During this time, Harvey started to identify as a woman and went by Marceline. He was released in 2019 and is now suspected to have murdered 68-year-old Susan Layden in Marceline's apartment.
Charles Schmid. Charles was born in 1942 in Arizona and was an illegitimate child and was adopted by 2 loving parents, though later in his life they divorced, and when he tried to meet his real mother, she told him to leave and never come back. Though when he was a teenager, he had the name Pied Piper because he was very charismatic and had a ton of friends. However, in 1964, Schmid decided to murder Alan Rowe, a high school student living with her divorced mother. He was assisted by 2 people for this act. However, he committed the crime. A few years later, he confided to one of his girlfriends, Gretchen, that he had committed this crime. He broke up with her, and when she threatened she would release the information, Schmid strangled Gretchen and her sister Wendy in 1965. Though Charles turned himself in and showed authorities the bodies, he had a long trial. In 1966, Schmid was found guilty of the murders and sentenced to death. He did try to escape multiple times, and once actually succeeding from Alcatraz. Wow, That's crazy. But eventually was recaptured on March 10th, 1975. Schmid was stabbed 47 times by 2 fellow prisoners.
Vaughn Greenwood. Vaughn Orrin Greenwood was a black American born in 1944 in Pennsylvania. Not much is known about Vaughn's background, however. He started his killing spree targeting transients when in 1964 when he shot 2 homeless men. Vaughn was sent to prison for a knifing incident in 1966 and was released in 1971. He decided to escalate his spree when he brutally murdered 9 people in the span of 2 months, from December 1974 to February 1975 in what is now known the Skid Row slasher. Stabbed and slashed homeless men to death. Vaughn also drank his victims' blood and ritualistically posed the bodies. He also sprinkled salt around the bodies. Vaughn burglarized the home of William Graham at the end of the spree. He attacked Graham with a hatchet before one of Graham's house guests, Kenneth Richard, intervened in the attack, in which both men plunged into the plate glass window. Vaughn fled on foot and burglarized another house, but carelessly left a letter addressed to him. Vaughn was arrested and in early 1976 was charged with the Skid Row slashings. He was convicted in 1977 and died in 2020.
Lawrence Victor. Born in 1933, Victor murdered 3 women between 1964 to 1987, with one of the murders being committed after being put on parole. Victor shot his first victim, Hilda Williams, over money and strangled her in a rage. He was arrested a week later and took a plea deal which he made them plead guilty to manslaughter to get only 8 years. He was paroled in 1967, and in 1976, he broke into a house of a 24-year-old Jerry Black. Black was talking to one of her friends on the phone. Victor would go in and stab and slit Black's throat and fled the scene. He was arrested the next day, along with his girlfriend, Iona Chase. Victor pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to only 20 years. Victor got paroled once again in 1986. The next year, he would get a job as a gardener for an 82-year-old lady who lived alone named Alice Singleton. He burglarized her home and beat her unconscious. He took a knife and slashed her throat, killing her. He ravaged through the house and left. Some witnesses saw Victor's car, which led to his arrest 3 days later. Convicted and sentenced to death in 1986. And in 1999, his death sentence was commuted to life in prison. He died in 2015 at the age of 82.
Juanetta Hoyt. Juanetta Hoyt was born in May of 1946 in the small town of New York Richford. Hoyt was a high school dropout and married Tom Hoyt. They had 5 children together. All of them died. The first child, James, died after 28 months. The rest of the Hoyt children died within 6 months after their birth. It was initially thought the children died of sudden infant syndrome, or SIDS. Hoyt was apprehended in 1994 after forensic pathologists reviewed a report on the Hoyt's children and concluded that they were murdered. Her motive is unclear, and there is speculation whether she was actually guilty, but nevertheless, Hoyt was convicted and died of pancreatic cancer in 1998.
Patrick Kearney. Born in 1939, Patrick Kearney was known as a weak and thin boy. He was often targeted by his peers who battered Patrick. Patrick would begin to have violent fantasies about killing his bullies. By the age of 13, Kearney had begun to engage with bestiality. Living in Texas, Kearney would move to California and work for an aircraft company as an engineer, and he was known as a modeled employee. Kearney had the ability to charm to any man he wanted. And after moving to Los Angeles, he moved in with David Hill, who became his lover. Kearney was known as the Trash Bag Killer, but was also known as the Freeway Killer, which was a moniker for two other serial killers, Randy Kraft and William Bonin, who are later going to be in this video, who operated in the same area with similar MOs. Kearney's modus operandi was to shoot and kill male victims, mostly transients, that he picked up at gay bars and along the freeway, and sexually assaulted and dismembered their corpses. He would dispose of said parts in various secluded areas or along the freeway. His first known victim was in 1962 when he drove the victim to a deserted spot and shot him in the head and later sodomized the body. The murder that Kearney was arrested for was John Otis LeMay in 1977. LeMay was a friend of Hill and had been invited to their residence. When LeMay arrived, Hill was not there but was invited in by Kearney. After sitting down, Kearney, without thinking, shot LeMay in the side of the head. He later dismembered the corpse and buried LeMay in his backyard. LeMay was named a missing person, and the cops, led right to Kearney, would flee along with Hill. Kearney and Hill would eventually turn themselves in. Hill was released, but Kearney confessed to murdering 28 people, possibly more. To avoid the death penalty, Kearney pleaded guilty and was sentenced to life, and is still alive and serving time in Mule Creek State Prison to this day.
Jane Gibbs. Jane Hickox murdered 5 members of her family by poisoning their food with arsenic for insurance money. Born on 1932 in Georgia, she married Charles Gibbs at the age of 15. She operated a daycare at her home as an adult and was known to be a devout Christian. She poisoned her husband with arsenic in 1965. He eventually died in 1966. August of the same year, Gibbs' 13-year-old son, Marvin, was poisoned by their mother, and he died. All of their deaths were thought to be caused by natural causes. Her only son, Robert, was 19 years old and had a child of his own, Raymond. Raymond was a month old and soon became sick, dying in October of 1967. Robert would soon fall a month after his son. An autopsy revealed large quantities of arsenic in their system, and the police were alerted. Janie was soon arrested, but was found insane by the state and put in an institution until 1976. She was charged with the murders and was convicted and was served to life, but was paroled for medical reasons in 1999. Gibbs died in February 2010 in a nursing home. Robert Liberty. Robert was born in 1947 in California. None of his early life can be found online. Only thing that I can conjure is that he found himself inside a hospital for a few years. Here, in 1966, while he was 19, he met a woman named Marcella. The two quickly got into a relationship and left the hospital together. On the 4th of June in the same year, Robert would strangle Marcella, killing her. After the murder, he dressed up the body and applied makeup to it before laying it on the couch and lit candles from her head to her feet and placing a Bible on her chest. Police entered the apartment, and upon entry, they found Robert playing a guitar next to Marcella's body, and he was promptly arrested. The judge found Robert criminally insane, and he was sent to a state hospital. Only 3 years later, in 1969, Liberty walked out of Metropolitan State Hospital a free man with no supervision required. He moved to Costa Mesa and lived with 3 other male roommates. In 1970, he fatally shot one of his roommates. He was charged with the murder, but took off to not be convicted of the crimes. Robert was on the run and came across Cannell Beerley and began dating her. The two were hitchhiking across the beach when 17-year-old Richard Gradack picked them up. Robert brandished a gun and forced him to his mother's house. Once there, Liberty took $45 from his mom. After this, he made his way to San Diego. he went to a nearby building with a 53-year-old patient inside. Robert tied up the patient and Richard together, but ultimately decided to kill the patient. It was at this point he fled the scene. Only 2 weeks later, Robert was caught attempting to kidnap a woman with another accomplice. Liberty, along with the cellmate Paul Rankin, were strangled to death by another cellmate. Kenneth McDuff. Kenneth was born in Texas in 1946. His youth life seems to have a past of being a bully all the way up until he was in late high school, when one kid he was bullying bullied him back, to the point where he would quit school and decide to work with his father. It would be here he would commit his first crime. You see, one day, in 1966, McDuff and his work acquaintance, Mr. Green, were pouring concrete for his father. After they finished for the day, Kenneth said he was looking for a girl and he came across 3 people: Edna, Robert, and Mark. Edna and Robert were in a relationship, and Mark was just a cousin of Robert. He threatened the trio with a .38 Colt revolver and ordered them to get in the trunk of his car. This is when Kenneth would shoot into the trunk of the car 6 times, killing 2 out of the 3. The last one that was alive, Kenneth strangled with his belt. The 2 went back to Mr. Green's house after they buried and disposed of the evidence. Kenneth would confess this murder to Mr. Green's mom, who made him turn himself in. Kenneth first received a death sentence in Texas, but then his death sentence was commuted to a life sentence. However, the prosecution deemed this was the time for a death penalty, so in turn he got it. He was put in the electric chair in 1998. Kenneth Harrison. Not much is known about Harrison, other than that he was born in 1939, and his mother was Polish. He dropped out of the 8th grade and started living in rooming houses. He murdered 4 people from 1967 to 1969 in Boston. Harrison was known as the Giggler because he called the police giggling in describing the location for one of the murder victims. His youngest victim was 4 years old, and his oldest was 75. His last murder was on December 26, 1969, and it was of 9-year-old Kenneth Martin in a subway tunnel. Martin was trying to hitch a train to a friend's house. He strangled Martin with twine and covered his body with a canvas. An officer patrolling the station found Martin's body. Multiple witnesses saw Harrison and Martin, and he was soon arrested. Harrison was sent to prison for life and committed suicide by swallowing bottles of antidepressants in 1989.
Richard Cottingham. Richard Cottingham was born in New York City in 1946 and was the eldest of 4 children. When he was 10 years old, his family moved to New Jersey, where he began an addiction to bondage porn. And a few years after that, he began a crime spree consisting of small crimes that included, but weren't limited to, drunk driving, shoplifting, robbery, and oral sodomy. Though between this time, he would commit his first of 17 murders. I won't go through all of them, though I will highlight a few. We'll start with the first one when he was 20 years old. He strangled Nancy Vogel, a 29-year-old mother of 2, in Little Ferry, New Jersey. The reason for this is unknown, but he was never charged with that crime due to lack of evidence. He only confessed to this crime in 2010. His crimes lasted from 1967 all the way up until 1980, and he only killed women around the ages of 16 to 33. They were mostly prostitutes near the New Jersey, New York areas. His final murder took place in a hotel. 17 days later, he took another prostitute to the same hotel, and her screams had staff call the police and burst into the room that Richard was staying in, where they'd find him with handcuffs, a leather gag, 2 slave collars, a switchblade knife, replica pistols, and a stockpile of prescription pills. Richard would receive life imprisonment for the first 4 initial murders. Richard lives in a prison hospital bed to this day, still alive.
Jerry Brudos. Jerry was born in 1939 in South Dakota. His mother deeply wanted a girl, and because of this, Jerry received a lot of trauma as a child. This also may be the reason he would devote a shoe fetish at the age of 5. In his teenage years, he would knock on women's doors, choke them unconscious, and run off with their shoes. At the age of 17, however, he would kidnap a woman and threaten to stab her with a knife if she didn't meet his sexual demands. He was of course arrested and was sent to a psychiatric center. They deemed that it was because of his mother on why he was acting this way. Despite being institutionalized, Jerry graduated from high school with his class in 1957. Shortly after graduation, he became an electronics technician. He met a young girl in 1961, married her, and everything was normal. Well, until he hit a transvestite period, in which he would wear his wife's clothing until that wasn't enough anymore. A door-to-door encyclopedia saleswoman who knocked on Jerry's door in 1968, he lured her inside his house into his basement and hit her with a block of wood and strangled her to death. He then dressed in her in different articles of clothing, and only a year later, Jerry would take a ride on Interstate 5 and find a woman named Jan, with her car being stuck on the side of the road. Jerry lured her into his car, strangled her, and kept her body in his house. He did this 4 more times while keeping all the bodies in the house except the last 2 women, which he killed in 1969. A gentleman found a couple bodies in the Long-Torn River where Jerry had dumped them. Police questioned Jerry and they had to go back to his house because he gave them a fake address. Upon inspection, the police found copper wire and the same copper wire that was attached to the bodies. Jerry was sentenced to life in prison and died of liver cancer in 2006. John Cannaday. John was born in Washington in 1945, though much of his early life is unknown. It is noted that he had a standard childhood. In December of 1957, a 16-year-old was found in her home, stabbed to death multiple times. Less than a month later, 2 other women would disappear under mysterious circumstances, and the only suspect was John. Once police questioned him, he instantly agreed that he would show them the bodies of the missing women, though they couldn't pin him on the first kill. They charged him with the 2 counts and he was sentenced to be hung. However, in 1972, the Supreme Court abolished the death sentencing for 30 states, and John was spared. On December 26, 2012, he was found unresponsive in his cell at Bay Prison. Tony Costa. Tony, or Charles Costa, was born in August in 1944. He, all the time as a child, was in trouble, all the way until he was 17, when he would be charged with burglary and assault after breaking into a house. He was sent to 3 years probation. In 1966, he was caught attempting to kidnap 2 girls, though no charges ever came from this. 3 years later, this would change when he would go on a spree of killing multiple different women. He would often chop their bodies and hide the parts. Though police were only able to charge him with 3 counts of murder, he was sentenced to 3 different life terms. Tony committed suicide by hanging himself in his cell. Joseph Breslin. Joseph was born in May of 1950 in Philadelphia. What's good to note is that Joseph had a few different mental disorders, and he spent time in 2 separate mental institutions. He killed a fellow patient in 1968 and attacked a nurse. But due to confidentiality, these incidents were covered up and details were never released. In 1982, Joseph went to the house of Linda Sue and knocked on her door. Once inside, and for unclear reason, he would proceed to stab her and her 8-year-old daughter, and would put their bodies in the bathtub. He took her keys and took her car to Nevada. While on the way there, a police officer pulled up on Joseph. Joseph brandished a .22 that he had concealed in his pocket and shot the officer in the back of the head. Once this happened, he attempted to shoot the local people who tried to help him. However, a gunfight ensued, and Joseph was shot 4 times and he died from his injuries. Leroy Snyder. Leroy was born in 1941 in February and was born with 6 other siblings. In 1949, though, he was charged with attempting to strangle a woman with a clothesline. He would find himself inside and outside of prison for the next 20 years. In 1969, he was arrested once again and charged with the murder of a 58-year-old Gertrude Friedman. She was found with her throat slashed just the day before, and the only reason he was caught was because he was wearing her watch, and a cop had noticed. On July 1970, he was connected to a string of violent murders that occurred throughout the previous year. He had committed 6 different killings in 1969, and all of those who were murdered were friends of his or at least acquaintances. Leroy admitted to all the murders. Under New Jersey law, he couldn't be sentenced to death after a confession, so on July 17th, Leroy was sentenced to 3 terms of life imprisonment. Leroy, who had served 31 years of his initial sentence, died in a New Jersey state prison at the age of 70. Gary Grant. Gary was born in Washington. He, much like the others on our list, had mental issues all the way from an early age and lived in poverty. He dropped out of school in the mid-1960s, and near the end of the decade, immediately enlisted into the Army. He only spent 4 months, and he returned to Washington. This is when the murders would start. On December 15th of 1969, Gary would attack and kill 19-year-old Carol in the evening part of the day. He would drag her body to nearby bushes, and he would have his way with her. Only less than a year later, in the middle of the day, Grant attacked 17-year-old Joanne Zuloff. He would hit her on the head with a stone and drag her body into the woods. Just a year after that, Gary would commit his final crime in 1971, when, on his way home, he would notice 2 6-year-old boys playing outside. He would then approach them in his vehicle and told them to get in, or he would kill them. The boys went in, and he took them to nearby woods, and he would beat them and kill them anyways. At this point, there was a full-time investigation on the murders, and the only thing they found was the knife about 50 feet from the last crime. After examination, they found out the gentleman who made the knife was in town. After a long game of sold it to this guy, the final person told them they lent it to Gary Grant just a year prior. Authorities detained Grant in his trailer that led him to. Less than 8 minutes into the interrogation, he stated that he suffered from amnesia and then bursted into tears. Confessing to the killings, Grant trials began in 1971. After a 2-day meeting, he was found guilty on all accounts and was sentenced to 4 life imprisonment terms without the chance of parole. The 71-year-old Grant is still alive, serving his sentence at the Monroe Correctional Complex. Carl Werner. Carl was born in Massachusetts in 1952. I guess anything this dude did in his childhood is redacted because I cannot find anything on him. 2 girls named Deborah and Kathy went out for a picnic in 1979 and they never came back home. They were reported missing and their bodies were found on a hillside in southern Allemande Valley. The girls were stabbed around 200 times combined. In 1971, an 18-year-old girl went to visit an art museum, though her body was found the next day by her father in some nearby woods. She was stabbed 17 times in the back and 32 times in her chest and stomach. The police correlated Carl to the crimes because multiple witnesses said that they saw a man matching his description with the 18-year-old girl. Werner had previously been a suspect in an unsolved knife assault on another woman, so they got a search warrant, and the moment they entered his home, they found the knife he used on the last murder. When he was arrested, he was thought to be the original Zodiac killer, though Werner is currently incarcerated at California Medical Facility in Vacaville. George Fitzsimmons. George was born in New York in 1937 and was an only child. He did, however, drop out of college and enlist in the Army, where he got addicted to stimulants, which gave him hallucinations. His parents sent him to a hospital to help with the addiction, and after some time, he was released and worked at a local YMCA. In 1969, Fitzsimmons got into an argument with his parents over attending church. This, in turn, caused him, in rage, bludgeon both of his parents with the tomahawk. He then stole his father's car and went to Massachusetts. and the bodies were discovered by neighbors only 11 days later. Though he made a stop at a bank along the way, the teller knew that this guy was on the run and called the police. George was apprehended. He was extradited back to New York and he was charged with 2 counts of murder. However, the judge said that he was a paranoid schizophrenic, so the judge sent him to Buffalo State Hospital, thus acquitting him of murder charges. He spent less than 3 years here and he was released, which, because he was not a threat to society. I wonder who made that blunder. Well, he met a woman, got married, got another charge for abuse on this said wife, then moved in with his uncle and aunt. He was convinced that they were trying to poison his food with arsenic, so in turn, he stabbed them both to death twice. He then got into the car, went to a local sandwich shop, called his lawyer to tell him what happened. He then sat on a curb and waited for police to take him in. George would spend the rest of his time at that hospital, succumbing to cancer in 1999.
Winford Stokes. Winford was born in Missouri in 1951 and was one out of 10 other children. Anything else to note is that he did drop out of school in the 8th grade. His first crime would be one of murder, but one of that he was just an accomplice to. He and a couple of other people robbed a local bar and one of them killed a stranger inside. The crew got arrested and on their way to be tried, they escaped. This happened one more time until he was charged and convicted to 9 years imprisonment for manslaughter and 3 other felony charges. It wasn't until 1977 that Winford would be released from prison. This would prompt him to rob the house of a 77-year-old man and beat him with a claw hammer. It wasn't fatal as the man survived. Stokes then broke into the apartment of 73-year-old widow Marie Montgomery only a few days later, this time shooting her and robbing what he could take inside. Stokes was later arrested on January 15, 1978 and was sent for pre-evaluation at a center. Stokes managed to escape from the facility with authorities right on his tail. He would be caught one final time after he killed a woman at a tavern. While on trial, he was able to flee one more time. Holy shit, what is this dude doing anyways? But wasn't able to make further than a mile away from the jail. Winford was sentenced to lethal injection, and on May 11, 1990, Winford Stokes was executed by lethal injection in the Potosi Correctional Center.
Gerald Santo. Gerald was born in 1951 in New York and was an only child, though at the age of 6 months, his mother paid him no attention, so he was sent to an adoption center. Gerald showed animalistic characteristics, so he wasn't allowed to be adopted. It took some years for someone working at the adoption agency to adopt him, though he still had a plethora of issues. He wetted the bed until he was 10, and he averaged C and D's on his grades except music, which he did exceptionally well. He did not graduate school until he was 21, and any and all jobs he would get after that, he would get fired from, usually theft from other coworkers, or tardiness. Instead of looking at each individual victim, Gerald has 22 confirmed murders and another 23 that he may or may not have done. They were all young girls, no one older than the age of 22. His motivation would be to find girls in bad circumstances and lure them to his car or house, and just kill them, usually by strangulation. He was housed with a fellow serial killer, Ted Bundy, until his death in 1998. Donald Beardsley. Donald was born in 1943 in Missouri and was the eldest of 3 children, though his father died when he was only 11. He joined the army when he was 19. Unfortunately, he and another airman were trying to steal a vehicle, so he was kicked out. In 1965, he was sentenced to work at a farm, and he would be hit in the head by a falling tree and would be in a coma state for weeks. In 1969, however, he would choke, stab, and drown Laura Griffin, a woman who he had just met at a bar. Though, right after the crime, he immediately turned himself in. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, received a 19-year sentence, and served 7 years before being released on parole in 1977. 4 years after leaving prison, while he was still on parole, Donald murdered 2 individuals who were involved in a drug deal. Donald was supposed to be purchasing drugs, but instead brandished a weapon, killing the 2, and then binding them with duct tape. Though Donald was apprehended only after a couple hours after the crime, the prosecution tried to fight for the non-death penalty, but of course, he was sentenced to death and was executed in 2005.
Michael Irvin. Joe Michael Irvin was born on June 25, 1951 in Fort Worth, Texas. Little information exists about his life, although he was a football player at Kirkpatrick High School located in Fort Worth. On August 9, 1969, Irvin and an unidentified friend jumped 21-year-old Rodney Bonham and Larry Holt. On August 9th, 1969, Irvin and an unidentified friend jumped 21-year-olds Rodney Bonham and Larry Holt while sitting in their chair in a bowling alley parking lot. Irvin shot Bonham in the neck after questioning him. The duo threatened Holt with the same fate if he did not comply, but Holt found an opportunity and managed to flee into the bowling alley itself. Holt was safe, but Bonham died from his injuries 4 days later. Irvin called the Bonham household to apologize for his killing. Irvin would eventually become a suspect and decided to flee to Colorado, where Irvin called the Bonham household to apologize for killing their son. Irvin would eventually become a suspect and decided to flee to Colorado, where he lived under the alias Joe Michael Irwig. 1970 through 1977 begins Irvin's crime spree, as he was charged but was never convicted of burglary, rape, child sexual abuse, and others. He was never found guilty due to diminished responsibility. Between 1978 and 1981, Irvin began a murder spree by ambushing people with brute force and stabbing them to death, resulting in 5 deaths, including that of a police officer. He was arrested 2 days after his birthday in 1981. Irvin hanged himself in solitary confinement with a makeshift rope made out of towels on July 1st. He was awaiting trial.
Stephen Morin. Stephen was born on February 19, 1951, in Rhode Island. He is a murderer who is suspected of committing multiple murders in 3 different states. His victims were mostly young women. He was a high school dropout and dealt dope to get some income. Stephen would be arrested in Florida for car theft and spent time in the late 60s in a juvenile institution. Stephen would murder Carrie Scott by shooting her in the back of the head of her car. He would be arrested and later convicted and sentenced to death. He is suspected to have committed 48 murders across the Sun Belt state, but was only convicted of 2. He was executed of lethal injection in 1985. Joseph Atkins. Joseph was born in 1947, and he would be the son of a sex worker who would later abandon him. He was adopted by abusive parents who would berate him and his adoptive siblings. They were living in North Charleston, South Carolina at the time. Atkins fought in the Vietnam War in places like Cambodia, where he saw massive amounts of violence, like people being tortured and mutilated. He would return home in October 1969 on New Year's Eve. He had gotten in a fight with his half-brother, Charles. Joseph would shoot Charles with a shotgun, and he was sentenced to life but was paroled in 1980, after his adoptive father pleaded to set him free. Joseph lived in a duplex that his adoptive father owned. The Patterson family moved into the duplex, but Atkins barely interacted with the family. In 1985, after binge drinking, Joseph cut the phone line and, armed with the shotgun revolver, proceeded to murder the daughter of the Patterson family and his adoptive father, who later came to the duplex. He was sentenced to death for these crimes and was executed in 1999.
Douglas Wright. Wright was born in 1940 in Iowa to a neglectful mother and an alcoholic father. He was physically and sexually abused and started to abuse others in the same way as he got older. Dropped out of high school and was kicked out by the Marine Corps for molesting a 5-year-old boy. In 1960, Wright was a prolific burglar and spent 8 years in prison. In 1969, Wright would murder a family friend, Margaret Rosenberry, and her granddaughter, Gail Snelling, shooting them to death. He kidnapped Gail's 5-year-old to a motel and sexually assaulted him. Wright would let him go, and this would cause a manhunt for Wright. He would evade capture for a month until a shooting, injuring a man in Banks, California. He was convicted for the murders. In prison, Wright was a model prisoner and was paroled in 1982. Right after his release, Wright committed several bank robberies. He abducted a 10-year-old boy, molesting him, and shot him, disposing of his body. Wright was convicted of the robberies, but not the murder, and spent time in prison until 1991, where he was released. In October 1991, Wright murdered 3 homeless men in remote areas. He would give the men alcohol before shooting them in the head. He was sentenced to death for 3 of the murders, but it is suspected he has killed up to 7 people. Douglas Wright was executed by lethal injection in 1996.
William Pierce. William was born in 1931 in Georgia. His family had lived through the Great Depression, and because of this, William spent most of his life poor and in poverty. In 1948, he dropped out of school, and after the 9th grade, took a job as a road worker. Though just a few years he would be let out due to health reasons, at some point in the 50s, William suffered a head injury that had him exhibit deviant behavior towards others and showed signs of personality disorder. In 1970, however, William would end up in South Carolina, and this is where he would commit all the murders. William entered a home at random. The home had 18-year-old Anne Godwin inside, getting ready to go babysit some neighbors' kids. He went inside, assaulted her, and stole a number of valuables and killed her. On December of that same year, 13-year-old Margaret left her home from Sumter, South Carolina, to join her sister for lunch. When the sister never showed up, a wide-scale manhunt ensued for the girl. Just 2 days after the girl's death, William drove to a nearby service station and shot a man to death who was running the store. In 1971, William would be trying to rob another gas station, though police were not very far away and caught him. After a lengthy interrogation, William confessed to all 4 murders and 7 robberies. He was convicted to multiple life sentences, and he died in 2020. Dean Corll. Dean was born in Indiana in 1939. He had a harsh father and a protective mother. His childhood consistently was up and down, leading the 2 parents divorcing in 1946. The mother had married a different man who plays a big role, but we'll get into him later. Dean ended up moving to Texas with his mother and stepfather, leaving his father in Indiana. Dean's stepfather had just started a candy business, and Dean at first had no interest. After losing jobs and being kicked out of the army, Dean ended up working at this job and doing very well, being known around town as the Candy Man. However, between 1970 and 1973, Dean is known to have killed a minimum of 28 victims. All of the victims were males, aged 13 to 20, the majority of whom were in their mid-teens. I'll go briefly over a few to note of. 18-year-old Jeffrey Conan was hitchhiking through Houston. Dean likely offered him a lift to his house, which he accepted. The next two victims were 14-year-old friends who were lured by Dean to his apartment. Dean strangled them and buried them in his shed. Now, what is to note is that for half of these crimes, Dean did have an accomplice, and for this, we'll call him Elmer. Dean's final day is probably of what's most important, because Dean didn't spend a night in jail, but he did get exactly what was coming to him. Elmer is important because he technically began this night. Elmer invited two young girls to come over to Dean's house. Dean had specific rules about who and who couldn't come over. Elmer tried to relax Dean with some paint fumes and marijuana. Eventually, all four of them fell asleep. Elmer awoke on his stomach with his hands cuffed. The two girls were also tied and bound next to Elmer. Dean, who noticed Elmer awake, told him that he was going to have his way with the girls and kill everyone after. Elmer had pleaded for his life and said that he would do the same thing to the girls if he unbound him. After 30 minutes, Dean agreed and untied Elmer. Elmer and Dean participated in terrible actions for around 20 minutes, until Dean told Elmer to take one of the girls into another room. Elmer reached for a .22 and pointed it at Dean, and told him that he had to stop. Dean told Elmer that he wouldn't shoot him, and if he was going to do it, do it. Elmer shot a round straight into Dean's forehead. Though the bullet didn't hit through the skull, Dean turned around and tried to run away. Elmer fired 3 more shots into Dean's back, killing him. As far as everything else is known, Elmer is serving his life sentence at Jefferson County, Texas. Carlton Gray. Carlton was born in 1950 in Georgia, and he had a terrible childhood. His father wanted nothing to do with him, and he had only met him once. His mother was very poor, so they had to constantly move. He was often left with his aunt or great aunt in elementary school, however. Carlton began to suffer head trauma and began violent tendencies and engaging in marijuana extremely young. Between the ages of 14 and 18, he was arrested numerous times for robbery, arson, and assault. During that time, he got married and had two children in the state of New York. In 1970, Carlton would murder 2 women who were staying in a hotel. He would have his way with them, strangle them, then rob them. After Gary attempted assault on a 3rd woman, he was arrested and his fingerprints matched one left at the scene of the former murder. Gary was charged with only 1 robbery, a sentence he served in the County Correctional Institution in New York. He was paroled only 5 years later. He did the exact same thing to 2 elderly women. However, 1 died and 1 survived. The police knew certain facts about the individual, most importantly a scarf, which Gary had been seen wearing. It was torn just like how the woman described, and Gary was arrested. His fingerprints were found at 4 of the crime scenes. Gary was indicted for the murders on May 5th in 1984 and sentenced to death on the following day. He was executed by lethal injection. Robert Danielson. Danielson was born in 1946 in Iowa. Although little was initially reported about his childhood, it was later revealed that Danielson had experienced depression and drug use. Later down the line in 1970, Robert would have a confrontation with a 21-year-old named Thomas due to the one cutting the other off in traffic. After some time, Robert brandished a gun and shot Thomas fatally. Robert was charged with the first-degree murder, but due to a mistrial because the prosecution had lack of evidence, the case was dismissed. Instead, in 1970, Danielson pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and several other charges, so he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. In 1981, only serving 11 years, he was paroled. Just weeks after his release, he decided to interact with an elderly couple near a campsite in Arizona. He bound their hands together and shot them in the head execution style. Their bodies were found the following day. While laying low, Robert found himself in a relationship with the 14-year-old. And yes, that was weird even for this time. Though, she would begin to accompany him on his next crime. The two would bound somebody, then shoot them in the head 3 more times. Detectives ended up coming across this girlfriend, and after only minutes confessed to the crimes, but told them about Robert's previous crimes. Robert was found and arrested while working at a traveling carnival. Though he did not turn himself in, he was considered a fugitive. Though he was captured and tried, a death sentence wasn't available, so in 1987, he was sentenced to life in prison. However, in 1995, while awaiting execution, he found a tube sock and killed himself in prison. Donald Harvey. Alright, so this guy has like 50, so I'm going to keep it very brief. Donald was born in Ohio in 1952. One thing is to note is that he was molested by his uncle and a neighbor, though he kept this to himself and only told his sister. When Donald was 18, he acquired a job as a hospital orderly, basically an assistant to the nurse. He would kill his patients by first taking out vital organs and, near the end, would just poison them. However, he did unintentionally kill somebody, just one time though. Investigators could not fathom why this hospital had such higher deaths than others, though Donald would slip up when his final patient's autopsy showed heavy amounts of cyanide. Donald was one of the first to think up because he had just gotten recently in trouble for attempting to steal bodies for occult rituals. In 1987, Harvey pled guilty to 24 counts of first-degree murder. Out of the 47, he actually did kill 24, had the most evidence and whatnot. Though he pled guilty to 34, he was incarcerated in the Ohio State Prison on 1987. Harvey was found dead severely beaten by his cellmates on March 28, 2017.
Tony Abels. Tony was born in Florida in 1952. Tony's first murder occurred at the age of 15 in 1970 when Tony attempted to rob a man in broad daylight and then shot him point blank, killing him instantly. He was immediately arrested and given life sentence, though he only served 12 years as he was released on parole and got a job as a construction worker. Just 5 months after he was released, he broke into an apartment of an elderly woman by breaking through her window and smothered her with a pillow, suffocating her to death. He then stole some things from her apartment and fled. 5 years later, on Valentine's Day, he would then murder his girlfriend, who was 31, and named Deborah. Abels was not charged with these crimes at the time. 2 years later, after getting into a drunken argument with his new girlfriend, Tony pushed her down the stairs and beat her to death. Neighbors had already called about a domestic dispute case, so cops were already there. As soon as they saw Tony, they arrested him on the spot. He initially was charged to be sentenced to death, but 2 years later, he was sentenced to life in prison. Tony is still alive to this day, serving in a correctional institution in Florida.
Sam Little. Sam has killed 60 confirmed people, and 93 are suspected. The majority of his crimes were sexually motivated, and he was arrested for countless of other crimes, like drunk driving and whatnot. But in 2005 was his final arrest, though it's very odd. This guy has actual video interviews, and he describes what he does with the bodies and whatnot. Also to note, so every time he committed a crime, there was never blood at the scene. Ted Bundy. Well, I'm going to assume you guys know who Ted is. If not, Ted was born in Vermont in 1946, and Ted would notice women and follow them. He would be well known for his charismatic tendencies, or he would dress up as a cop. And doing this, he would end up killing more than 30 women, though his motive would be wanting the thrill and the killing of women. He was executed by electric chair in 1989. Rodney Alcala. Rodney was born in Texas in 1943, born to a Mexican couple. In 1954, Rother's father abandoned him, and when he was around 11, his mother moved him and his sister to LA. He committed his first crime in 1968, where he would abduct an 8-year-old, beat her, and when she was found, Rodney had already fled the state. He went to NYU and went under the name John Berger and obtained a counseling job. At this point, Rodney was put on the top 10 most wanted fugitives list, though they couldn't find him because of the different names that he used. One of the kids at the camp he worked at noticed the picture at a post office. Rodney was arrested for the abduction of the 8-year-old, but they could only charge him with molestation and not attempted murder. He served 3 years. What is to note is that this guy appeared on the show The Dating Game, and everyone on the set noted that he was a weird guy. He actually won the competition on the show, where he went against 3 other bachelors to get a bachelorette. Note that before this, Rodney is known to have committed 3 different murders. She ended up not going on the date, which in turn saved her life most definitely. Rodney was arrested in July of 1979, and a year later was convicted and sentenced to death. However, it was overturned and he was sentenced to life in prison. He died of unspecified natural causes in California in 2021 at the age of 77. Bruce Davis. Bruce was born in 1948 in Ohio, who was a pretty rough guy. He murdered 2 individuals and was caught on that almost immediately, though he spent a few years in prison. He was considered a model inmate for good behavior and worked as a loader in the prison. He used to cut a hole through the fence and get away. Though he killed the warden, stole his car on that escape. He was caught 2 days later and taken back to jail and spent the rest of his life in prison. James Coedaic. Born in 1948, not much being known about James' life, he committed his first murder in Florida in 1971. James murdered his roommate, Robert Anderson, and was quickly arrested for it. He was convicted and served 11 years before being paroled in 1982. While in prison, he killed his cellmate, although the homicide had been ruled as self-defense. James was released in August and subsequently moved to New Jersey. On November 23, 1982, he kidnapped an 18-year-old girl named Amy Hoffman outside the mall where she worked. James drove to a secluded area before assaulting and stabbing her to death. He dumped her body in a reservoir. She was found 2 days later. Some witnesses had come forward giving a description of the man who Hoffman was with. On December 5th, James would run 25-year-old Deidre off the road and kidnap her at knife point. He grabbed and stabbed her before fleeing the area. O'Brien was found alive, but died shortly after arriving at the hospital. James would later contact police, claiming someone had stabbed him in the back while driving. The police noticed his car matching the description of the attacker of O'Brien. He was eventually arrested and convicted of both murders. James was sentenced to death, but was later commuted to life in prison. He still resides in prison at the age of 74. Judy Bueno. Judy Welty, born and raised in Texas. In 1943, her mother died when she was 4 and moved in with her grandparents. She would move back to her father and stepmother in New Mexico. She was reported abused by her stepmother, who treated her like a slave. Her history of violence began when she physically attacked her family and spent 2 months in jail. She married James Goodyear in 1962 and they moved to Florida. Goodyear was a sergeant in the Air Force. Judy poisoned him in 1971 and he died. No foul play was suspected in his death, and Judy collected a life insurance policy that was on him. Judy would change her name to Bueno, which in Spanish slang for good year. In 1973, Judy moved in with her boyfriend, Bobby Joe Morris, in Colorado. He would die in 1978. Judy's son, Michael, was in the Army and was stationed at Fort Benning, Georgia. Michael paid a visit to his mother, who moved back to Florida after Morris's death. When Michael arrived on base, he began to feel sick. He was poisoned with arsenic and he was paralyzed as a result. Michael would drown in a canoe accident and Judy would collect the insurance money. Judy would open a beauty shop and begin a relationship with the businessman, John Gentry. She attempted to murder Gentry. The deaths of all 3 men were eventually connected and Judy was arrested. She was sentenced to life in prison for Michael Goodyear and death to James Goodyear. She was executed by the electric chair in 1998. Frank Davis. Born in 1953, Frank Davis was sexually abused by an attendant and another inmate when he was in juvie. In June 1971, Davis killed 13-year-old Duane Bush. He sodomized and strangled Bush to death, leaving his body in a wooded area. After this murder, David was convicted to 10 years for a robbery of a grocery store for $40. He was paroled in 1982. In January of 1983, he sexually assaulted a 15-year-old boy at gunpoint. He wrapped wire around the boy's neck and pistol whipped him until he was unconscious. The boy would survive the attack. In June of that same year, 14-year-old Darren Reed vanished when walking to his girlfriend's house. His body was found 3 days later, strangled and sodomized. 2 days later, Frank was smoking marijuana in the woods. Jeff Lopez and another boy camping met with Davis, who he later shared the marijuana with. After Lopez and his friend went back to their tent falling asleep, Davis abducted Lopez by knife point. Davis took Lopez to a clearing and sodomized him. He later killed Lopez with an axe, leaving Lopez almost decapitated. Davis did the same to the other boy, but he survived this attack. He identified Davis as his attacker, and Davis confessed to the murder of Lopez and Duane Bush. He was sentenced to 60 years in prison for the two murders and died in prison in 2008. Robert Hansen. Robert was born in Iowa in 1939. Robert grew up as what we the kids call these days an incel. Robert from a young age really respected women, almost to a creepy extreme. No girls in his high school or town would give him the time of day. This had him growing up hating women, and he had fantasies of cruel revenge on them. He joined the army out of high school. It is to note that he would be told that he was an excellent marksman and had very good aim. He was arrested after lighting the school bus garage on fire. Not long after this, in 1967, he moved to Alaska because his life was going terribly in Iowa. He staged a false robbery at his home and took the insurance money from that and opened a bakery. With the money he made from that, he bought himself a plane. This would be the beginning of Robert's downfall. He would pick up prostitutes and bring them to his plane. He would fly them somewhere in the Alaskan wilderness and murder them. He did this for 17 women. He would release them into the wilderness and hunt them. Very frightening. One woman was able to escape in 1983, and she is the only reason Robert was caught sooner than later. She somehow remembered the tail number of the plane, and that led authorities straight to Robert. He was arrested and suspected of 21 murders. He showed investigators 17 of them. He died in 2014 in prison.
Randy Kraft. Known as the Scorecard Killer, born on March 19, 1945, Kraft lived in a modest household, being in a nuclear family. Living with 2 parents and 3 sisters, Kraft learned he was a homosexual when in high school, even though he did date girls. Kraft was a straight A student and finished 10th out of 390 in his class. Kraft's victims were all male and between the ages of 13 and 35. Committing his first murder in 1971, Kraft is suspected to kill at most 67 people. He murdered in different kinds of ways, from poisoning to bludgeoning to strangulation. Kraft's reign of terror would end on May 14, 1983, when Kraft was arrested for driving while intoxication with a dead body in the passenger seat. What the fuck was this man up to? Was he just like... This man would later be identified as 25-year-old Terry Lee Gambrill. Randy Kraft was arrested and was sentenced to death. He remains on death row at San Quentin Prison in California.
John Hooker. John was born in Oklahoma in 1953. When John turned 17, he was attending a party, and we had gotten into an argument with one of the guests. The two got into a scuffle when John pulled out a gun and opened fire and killed the other 18-year-old and injured 2 others. This was quickly reported to police, and John was convicted of this charge and served time in prison. He was released after some time and developed a relationship with a woman named Sylvia. They never married, but they had several children. The two had a ton of marital problems. They divorced, but in 1988, John took a knife, broke into Sylvia's apartment, and murdered her. John waited inside the house for Sylvia's mother, who he also ended up stabbing to death. Exactly 9 years later, with his pants still having blood on them, Hooker was found guilty and swiftly sentenced to death. On March 25, 2003, John was executed by lethal injection in Oklahoma prison.
James Poe. Born in February of 1948, James was the eldest of 9 children and developed a bad case of asthma. At the age of 18, he began working as a common laborer, which he continued to do until his death. In May of 1971, James got into an argument when his best friend called his girlfriend a bitch. He then brandished a gun and shot his friend 3 times. James was charged with murder, although the charge was later reduced to manslaughter. He was then sentenced to 5 years probation. It was noted that James should never be allowed to own a gun due to his behavior. Though in 1990, James would acquire an M1 carbine and would shoot a man on the streets of Jacksonville. After killing this man, he traveled around the next corner and ran over another man, then would shoot 2 women in the head. He would then rob a convenience store and would make his getaway to the GMAC building. As he approached, he opened fire at customers and employees. He would end up killing 13 people and injuring 6 people, and would then commit suicide the very next day.
Marvin Gray. Born on August 7th, Marvin Gray suffered from panic attacks at a young age. He took drugs as a result. Marvin was arrested for the first time at the age of 12, which began a long reign of criminal activity that would leave Martin in and out of jail for the rest of his life. Marvin would eventually be arrested for burglary after being paroled in 1992. He was sentenced to life in prison, and Marvin began to take up weightlifting, setting a few world records. He began confessing to multiple murders, a few of which Marvin was convicted of. Being convicted of 3 murders, it is also suspected that he had killed more than 20. He died in 2013 of heart failure at the age of 58. So, for these next 7, we'll just do a lightning round. Go. Charlie Bandit. Shot his parents in 1971 when he was 13, killing his pregnant mother, stabbed his wife and niece to death in 2004, and killed himself. Brent Costner, known as the Scorecard Killer, kept a coded list of young men and boys that he raped and murdered in Southern California, Michigan, and Oregon. He was sentenced to death for his crimes. Herbert Mullen. He killed 13 people in California in the early 1970s. On August 18, 2022, Mullen died at the age of 75. Philip Hughes killed 3 women with his ex-wife in Contra Costa County, California, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Adolf Londenberg. Why would you give this guy that name? Known as the Santa Strangler, murdered women in the San Pedro neighborhood of Los Angeles and one in San Francisco, and is the prime suspect for 2 similar murders and was sentenced to life in prison. Neil Long, known as the Shotgun Slayer, racist who murdered black people in drive-by shootings in Dayton, Ohio, died in Federal Medical Center. Robert Carr, pedophile who targeted children in both Florida and Connecticut and died in prison. John Wayne Gacy. Oh boy, another famous one. John Wayne Gacy was born in 1942 in Chicago, and he is most well known for being a clown killer that killed 33 boys from 1972 until 1978. 26 of these bodies were found underneath his home. He got the clown moniker because he would dress up as a clown and host parties for children. John Wayne Gacy was sentenced to death and died from lethal injection. Something to note is that it took 18 minutes to kill him because the IV tube got clogged, and so after this, a lawyer stated that even though he died in pain, it is said it happened much easier than how he killed any of his victims. John Hopkins. John Hopkins was born in 1953 in New York. Not much is known about his early life. What is known is that he did at one point in his teens develop a fascination with knives. John began his crime on a 19-year-old college student when he abducted her and stabbed her numerous times, killing her. He then drove by a donut shop just 2 months later and abducted a 17-year-old girl, who he would take to some isolated section of railroad tracks in Mohawk, then grape her and stab her and bury her in a shallow grave. He did this again successfully and tried it again one more final time, this time abducting a 17-year-old woman from the bar and left her tied up in the forest. However, a nearby logger untied her the following day and she led police directly to him. In 1980, the judge sentenced Hopkins to a 25 to life term for 3 charges, all of which were run consecutively. However, in 2011, he committed suicide by cutting the back of his legs with a razor. Alvin Johnson. Alvin was born in 1941 in Texas and was one of 14 children born to a farmer. When he was young, he was struck with the hard end of an axe, which led him to get heavy amnesia and potentially schizophrenia. Though, in his teens and later, he was surviving by working as a laborer on various farms. However, in 1972, he would break into 50-year-old Roger Geller's home, who was a cook. He beat Geller on the head and finally strangled him, before stealing his wallet and money and fleeing the hotel. The day after, Alvin was arrested and imprisoned, but would attempt to flee with the fellow inmate. He actually ended up getting shot in the shoulder by an officer during this flee. He was arrested and was sentenced to 10 years. In 1983, he was released. He met with another fellow murderer to prey upon a 76-year-old person, whom they proceeded to grape and strangle to death. For his final crime, he alone traveled to Utah and came upon 38-year-old James M. Clark and his wife Ann Lee, who he kidnapped and kept in a warehouse. Ann Lee escaped, but James was not spared. Police caught Alvin the next day on a train, and he was sentenced to 2 life sentences with a chance of parole. As of October 2021, it is unclear whether he remains in prison or if he's still alive. John Thomas, or John Floyd Thomas Jr., was born in 1936 in California. In his youth, his mother died when he was 12, and he served in the Air Force in 1954. He received a dishonorable discharge for attempted in LA and was convicted of these crimes and spent 6 years in California State Prison. In the mid-1970s, he would go on a string of breaking into elderly women's homes, raping them, and then suffocating them. Though, as of 2009, linked to 1975 and 1976 murder, Thomas was arrested on March 31, 2009. He was charged with 7 murders, but investigators strongly believe he could have done more than 15. He pleaded guilty so he wouldn't get a death sentence. He is still imprisoned at the healthcare facility in California. Wayne Garrison. Born in 1959 in Oklahoma, he had a history of violence. He killed his pet rabbit when he was 14, and on Halloween night, he dragged his cousin into a crawl space, tied a headband around her neck very tightly until she was unresponsive. His cousin's father the next morning became scared when he could not find his daughter and called the police. After a short inspection, found her in the crawl space. Wayne was actually suspected and confessed shortly thereafter. A judge sent him to a memorial hospital in Oklahoma. In 1975, Garrison was allowed a 10-day leave, and here he would kidnap a 3-year-old and suffocate him to death. They somehow linked Garrison to this crime as well and gave him an additional 4 years in prison. When he was released at the age of 17, he would graduate high school. Garrison moved and had a son. And in 1983, he abducted a 13-year-old and molested him and killed him. Garrison quickly moved his family to Charlotte, North Carolina. However, Garrison wouldn't be charged with this crime until later. Garrison was arrested for giving narcotics to an 11-year-old boy and pleaded guilty for this and was sent to prison. However, in 1999, he was only released for a mere few minutes because police were able to find evidence on the body against Garrison, and he was arrested shortly thereafter his release. Wayne resides in prison to this day, still alive.
Arthur Shawcross. Known as the Genovese River Killer, Shawcross was born in 1945 in Kittery, Maine. The Shawcross family would move to Watterson, New York, where the first known murders that Arthur committed would take place. Arthur made good grades in his school, but was below average in intelligence after scoring an 86 on an IQ test. Although his early life would be far from normal, Arthur was known to be a bedwetter and by the age of 7 had his mother perform oral sex on him. A few years later, he was having sexual relationships with his sister. At school, Arthur was a bully and dropped out in 1960. He would then join the army at age 21, and by then he had already married and had an 18-month-old son. The marriage didn't last, and Arthur and his wife got divorced, and he never saw his ex-wife or his son again. He served one tour in Vietnam and claimed to have seen several violent war crimes take place. After being discharged from the army, Arthur would marry his second wife, and she too would divorce Arthur after he was arrested for starting fires. Arthur committed his first murder in 1972 by killing a 10-year-old boy after luring him into the woods. Arthur would also kill and rape an 8-year-old girl, which would lead to his arrest. He pleaded to a lesser charge of manslaughter and would get out of prison on April 1987. Arthur began another killing spree from early 1988 to late 1989, killing 12 people. As Arthur was dumping a body, he was spotted by a witness, which would lead to his arrest. Arthur was convicted and would eventually die in 2008 at the age of 63.
George Jones. Born in Mississippi in 1945, there is not much information on his youth, though his first major crime would be the murder of Porder Jones in 1972. He was only sentenced to 5 years in prison. After serving out a sentence, he moved to Wisconsin, and he developed an addiction to drugs and gathered a bunch of convictions through that. Though, in 1997, he would have a string of murders of prostitutes or women who were addicted to a hard substance. At the final time he was apprehended, he was convicted of 3 murders, though it's speculated he's done more. Jones served his sentence in Waupun until his death from natural causes in 2012. Bernard Giles. Born in 1953 in Florida, Giles had 3 other siblings, and his parents were moral, upstanding parents, and they had a happy adulthood. Though, in high school, he would leave due to poor academic performance. He mastered the art of an electrician and began working in 1972 and married a 17-year-old girl who he would have a daughter. However, in late September of 1973, he would go on a killing spree of girls between the ages of 14 and 22. The girls would be hitchhiking in wooded areas of Brevard County. He would either bound their hands and strangle them or just shoot them in the back of the head. Giles would slip up when he would try to lure 2 girls in December of that same year. His gun would misfire and they would get away. The next day he was arrested because of a book that he had in his car that one of the girls remembered. He was tried and convicted in 1974 and was given several terms of life imprisonment. He is still alive to Florida of this day. Douglas Gretzler. Douglas was the second of 4 children. He was born on May 21st in 1951 in the Bronx, New York. His father was a strict disciplinarian and the president of the Tuckahoe School District, and his mother was a housewife. His father would dote over Gretzler's older brother Mark and frequently compared him and his sisters to Mark. As a result, Gretzler was an unmotivated student and made poor grades. Mark committed suicide in 1966, and Gretzler's drunken father told him why it should have been him and not Mark. Gretzler graduated in 1969, but did not pursue any other education, instead working at a mechanic shop and developed a drug habit. In 1970, Gretzler would move to Florida and marry a woman and have a child. They would move back to New York where, in late 1972, Gretzler abandoned his wife and child and traveled to the West. It was in Denver, Colorado that Gretzler would meet Willie Luther Steelman at Steelman's sister's house. They hit it off and a fatal friendship formed. Steelman's sister abandoned her home Gretzler and Steelman were staying at, and they decided to head to Arizona, then California, where, over the course of 3 weeks, would go on to abduct and murder 17 people, including the murder of an entire family. Gretzler and Steelman would abduct, murder, and steal vehicles from their victims. They were eventually caught on November 8, 1975. Both were convicted and sentenced to death. Steelman died before he could be executed from cirrhosis in 1986. Douglas Gretzler was executed in 1998 via lethal injection. Calvin Jackson. Calvin was born in 1948 in New York. He came from a poor family who lived in an urban area. In his teenage years, he became addicted to drugs, and after passing the 10th grade, he would drop out of high school. In 1973, Jackson would begin his killing spree by killing 8 women who lived in a Plaza hotel. He did this for only a year, and on his last victim, he would be seen stealing a television and caught by police. His interrogation would take a total of 30 minutes because he would immediately confess to all 8 murders. He He was sentenced to 4 life sentences and is still in prison to this day.
Waldo Grant. Waldo was born in 1946 in Georgia. When he turned 16, he became a self-ordained minister for a gospel church. His neighbors described him as a quiet loner, thought this would be further from the truth. In 1973, Grant murdered a 20-year-old man named Philip by hitting him with a lead pipe. Waldo somehow made it look like an accident and was able to evade arrest. Almost 2 years later, a 23-year-old man was found in a trash can when he had been stabbed multiple times in the back. Waldo would later be charged with this crime. He would do this 2 more times, and for his final crime, police interrogated him multiple times for over the span of 2 weeks and would spill the beans when he stated that his final victim was attractive and desired him very much. Waldo was sentenced to life in prison and resides in Greenhaven Correctional Facility.
Steven Anderson. Steven was born in Utah and was the older brother of one other child, though when Steven and his brother were 14, they were kicked out of their home. So at some point, Steven got himself into contract killings and successfully killed 6 people, though his last crime he would commit for self-robbery, which he killed a woman and only got $100. He then went downstairs of her home, made a sandwich before he was arrested by authorities. He was sentenced to death and was executed by lethal injection. Jerry McFadden. Jerry was born in 1948 in Texas and kidnapped 3 girls who were 18, 19, and 20 respectively. He took them to Lake Hawkins in Texas, strangled and raped the girls here. However, even before he did this, he would spend 15 years in prison for 2 counts of rape, but was paroled in 1978. However, he was linked by DNA match in 1979 for the kidnapping and murder of those 3 girls, and was sentenced to death by lethal injection in 1999. Eddie Mosley. Eddie was born in 1947 in Florida, and he is suspected of committing 150 different acts of sexual assault on women, though 40 he has been convicted of. However, he would also murder 9 of these women, though it's believed he's killed 15. He was sentenced to death, however, and died on death row in 2000 of cancer complications.
Daniel Hiddle. Daniel was born in 1950 in Indiana. He was adopted at an early age by 2 farm owners. As a child, people described him as polite and quiet. Eventually, he would develop a hatred for his stepmother. And in April of 1973, his step-parents' dog would scratch his car. He and his mother would argue, and Daniel said that he did not dare to shoot her, only for him to do this. When her husband tried to get his own gun, Daniel would shoot him as well. The sound of the 2 gunshots was heard by 2 neighbors, and police immediately came and arrested Daniel. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 30 years of prison, though he was let out on parole in 1984. He would then gain a wife. However, he would eventually start doing drugs and would get into arguments with his drug dealer. One day, he and his wife got into an argument, and he would grab his shotgun and headed to the drug dealer's house. But he was pulled over by a cop. As the cop approached him, Daniel was afraid that he would see the shotgun. So when he got to Daniel's car, he shot the officer in the chest. He would then arrive at his dealer's home and open fire, killing her and 2 of her friends. He then noticed the dealer's 4-year-old daughter, and after reloading the shotgun, would shoot her in the face. He was arrested and tried for only 5 counts of murder, and was given the death sentence. On December 6, 2000, Daniel was executed via lethal injection.
Robert Knighton. Robert was born in 1941 in Missouri, and little is known about his youth, though it is known that he did not like to talk much, though it's said that he did idolize Elvis Presley and wanted to become a singer. In 1968, Knighton was convicted of armed robbery in Oklahoma and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Shortly after this release, he would be wanted for murdering Claude Day by shooting them with a pistol. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison. In 1989, he would be sent to a halfway house where he would begin a relationship with a woman named Ruth and a friendship with a man named Lawrence. It was figured out his friend Lawrence would be on restrictive leave. Once Robert knew this, he and Lawrence fled the city. They drove to a friend of Lawrence's parents, stole their pistol, and killed 2 people living inside the home. Robert and his accomplice were arrested and tried for the crime, and Robert was executed by lethal injection at the state penitentiary in 2003. James Red Dog. This guy only killed 2 people. I just figured he was good to talk about because Joe Biden introduced legislation that required states to be notified by federal officials when dangerous criminals were placed in their jurisdictions. I just figured that was important enough to share.
Kenneth Granville. Born in Texas in 1950, Kenneth had a half-brother and was raised by a single mother. Kenneth was considered an odd and reclusive child who was often by himself and had very few friends, and almost never interacted with girls. In 1967, Kenneth broke into his mother's room and attempted to rape her, but Kenneth would eventually come to his senses and stopped. His mother called the police, which resulted in him spending the next 10 days in John Peter Smith Hospital. After being temporarily released, he would then attempt to sexually assault his brother, which resulted in him being sent to Gatesville State School, where he'd spend the next 2.5 years. Once he was released, he found a job at a manufacturing company, and would begin dating Everline Gold, who had 3 sisters. At one point, he had the urge to rape one of his girlfriend's sisters, and so he went to her apartment and found that her entire family was there. He was able to get inside by asking for a glass of water, and when he went in, went to where the sister was, and ordered her and her child to go into the back room. When the rest of the family came to investigate, he decided to tie them up. He then led the sister into the other room and sexually assaulted her. He would then strangle, stab, and murder the rest of the family and fled the scene. He was never arrested for these crimes. Instead, 2 others were charged. Feeling the urge to kill again, he would eventually go to his neighbor's apartment and did essentially the same thing. Kenneth then drove to the police station and turned himself in. He was sentenced to death and attempted an appeal in 1993. Kenneth was executed via lethal injection at the Huntsville unit on February 27, 1996.
Joseph Kallinger. Born in 1935 in Philadelphia, Philip would consistently rebel against his parents, though his parents would heavily abuse him. He obtained a wife and had 2 children, though Joseph would be in and out of prison for multiple reasons. However, in 1972, Joseph and his 12-year-old son would go on a killing spree through Baltimore and New Jersey. The 2 would gain entrance in the homes by acting as salesmen, then would bound the people and proceed to kill them. He was charged with 3 counts of murder and spent 12 years behind bars before he died of heart failure in 1996. Francis Nemchek. Francis was born in 1950 in Kansas and had 2 other siblings and is known as a top student in both high school and college. He later got married and fathered 1 child. After some time though, he got a divorce and got a job as a truck driver. He would continue to live with his parents. In 1974, while on the road, Francis shot the tire of a red Toyota and had the car spinning out in front of him. He then walked towards the car with a gun and told 3 people to get into his truck: Diane, Cheryl, and William, Cheryl's son. They were 19, 21, and 3. He would then begin to drive to an acquaintance's farm and kill the 2 girls, but would leave William behind. He would die, however, from hypothermia. 2 years later, he would do this 2 more times, killing 2 more people. However, he was later identified as the last person seen with one of his last victims. In 1976, he was charged with the 5 murders and is still alive to this day, imprisoned at Lansing Correctional Facility. Ray Sims. Ray is responsible for the murders of at least 5 girls in California from 1974 to 1977. Originally convicted of a single murder, he was later then linked to the later killings via DNA in 2001. He has been convicted of 1 more crime and is currently serving 2 life terms and is still imprisoned at the California State Prison. Randy Greenawal. Randy was born in 1949 in Missouri and originally sentenced to life imprisonment for 2 murders committed in 1974. Greenwalter later became notorious for escaping together with fellow murderer Gary Tyson and his 3 sons from prison, embarking on a 2-week killing spree through Georgia, Arizona, and Colorado, and left 6 people dead in 1978. He was promptly sentenced to death and thereafter executed in 1997, in his case serving as the basis for the Supreme Court decision Tyson v. Arizona. Roger Stafford. Born in 1951 in Alabama, Roger was convicted for the 1978 murders of the Lawrence family and 6 employees of Sirloin Stockade restaurant in Oklahoma. Stafford never acknowledged his guilt, but Stafford's wife, Berna, implicated him in a total of 34 murders in 7 different states. However, he would have loose assistance from his wife. For instance, she would flag the Lorenzo family down in the husband, wife, and son inside. Stafford robbed and killed the entire family, and he would then attempt to rob a Sirloin Stockade and shoot 6 employees. They found Verna, Roger's wife, and arrested her. She pretty much told them everything because they promised her no death sentence if she did. Stafford was executed by lethal injection in 1995. Thomas Knight. Thomas, who was born in 1951, is most well known for murdering a Miami couple before making them withdraw $50,000 from their account. He is also known for fleeing from prison with other inmates and going on a killing spree. What is known about his youth is that he's the second eldest of 9 children, and he was arrested for theft multiple times before he was 10. However, his most serious crime would be against his boss and his wife for making them withdraw $50,000 from their account like I mentioned before. When he was arrested and sent to 25 years in prison for this, he escaped with another inmate, and it would be here he would kill 2 more people due to him trying to rob 2 men and them not complying. While in prison for this, he would stab his corrections officer to death with a spoon. For some reason, Thomas's death sentence was delayed for multiple reasons. However, he was executed on January 7th by lethal injection. Thomas Creech. Thomas was born in 1950 in Ohio and grew up in a very unstable household, to which his parents would divorce him and he would end up living with his father, who he would watch die in front of him. Thomas, in 1974, would murder 2 painters with the rifle while Thomas was hitchhiking, and the 2 painters picked him up. Thomas was caught for this murder and was sentenced to life in prison. However, while he was here, he would kill another inmate who was a car thief and got into a scuffle with. With this, he was sentenced to death, though he is still alive to this day in Idaho maximum security prison. Carl Watts. Carl was born in 1953 in Texas and is known as the Sunday morning slasher. His father was a private first class in the Army and his mother was a teacher. His parents separated when he was 2 and he moved in with his mom. Though, in 1969, when he was 16, he would be identified by police in the assault of a 25-year-old woman on her paper route. He was put in a clinic when he was 16 and he would be released on good behavior. It would be good to mention that the interrogator would say that he is very intelligent and has a great recollection of memory, though he was only able to read at a 4th grade level. When he was 20, he would begin kidnapping victims from their homes and torturing them, then murdering them. He would do this to 14 people, but it is believed that he may have done it to nearly 100. Though he was first set up to spend 60 years in prison, he was given like 12 consecutive life sentences. He died of prostate cancer in 2007. Roy Melanson. Roy was born in 1937 in Louisiana, and he is known as a drifter and a con artist in his youth, though he may or may not have killed an inmate in prison at this time. In 1974, he would stab 51-year-old Anita Andrews 13 times with a screwdriver and left her body in a pool of blood on the floor. It would take decades for Roy to be connected for this crime. A few months later, Roy would commit a similar crime. He would befriend a victim months before he would kill him. He would do this 3 times and having a confirmed kill count of 5. He was apprehended for the final time in 1992, and he died in 2020 serving his sentence. Dennis Rader. Dennis was born in 1945 in the state of Kansas. Dennis had 3 other siblings and two parents who spent most of their time at work, not focused on the kids. Dennis particularly resented his mother for this for some reason. He, also at a young age, would fantasize about torturing and kidnapping women. In 1974, a husband, wife, and 2 of their children would be found murdered. Dennis would admit to these crimes in 2005 after he was arrested for the final time. Dennis would kill 7 more women until late February of 2005. An officer saw a raider driving in the park and pulled him over. The officer recognized Raider because of previous description. He was tried and convicted of 7 murders, and since there is no death sentence in Kansas, he was sent to 145 years in prison and is still alive to this day.
William Suff. Being born in 1950 in California, Suff subsequently raped, tortured, stabbed, strangled, and sometimes mutilated 12 or more women in Riverside County between June 28, 1989 and December 23, 1991. On January 9, 1992, Suff was arrested after a routine traffic stop when a police officer found a bloody knife and objects believed to be related to the killing. Suff worked as a warehouse clerk for Riverside County when he was arrested, having been hired while still on parole from Texas. During this time on this job, Suff delivered office furniture to the officers on the task force investigating his killing spree. In 1995, William was sentenced to death and is still alive to this day in a California state prison on death row.
Wow, we finally just hit the murderers that started being committed in 1975. That's pretty crazy. Charles Davis. Charles was born in 1945 in Maryland, and being the son of a police lieutenant, Charles would commit his murders from 1974 to 1977, killing at least 3. Because of his thirst for media attention and to confuse the investigators, he called the authorities anonymously and provided directions to where he had left his bodies. Ironically, he was pulled over and arrested because it was suspected that he stole a CB radio, and when he showed a receipt to the officer, it was a stolen credit card from the person from his last crime. However, he ended up not killing this person, so she was brought in and she 100% identified that Charles was the person who was trying to kill her. He was sentenced to life in prison and he is still alive, currently serving his life sentence at the Correctional Institute in Jessup. Larry Ralston. Larry was born in 1949 in Ohio, though when he was 17 he would join the army. Once he returned home, he would live with his parents all the way up until his arrest. Larry would murder 5 hitchhikers and would abduct the victims, all teenagers or young children. He would scatter their remains across the field. Larry was arrested and picked out from a line of criminals who matched the description. His DNA was matched at all of the different crimes. As of 2022, Larry is still alive and currently imprisoned at correctional institution. Billy Mansfield. Born in 1956 in Michigan, Billy is responsible for the murders of 5 women and girls between 1975 and 1980. He buried the bodies of 4 victims at the family home in Spring Hill, Florida, and later traveled with his brother to California, where he raped and strangled a woman. He was convicted of the latter homicide and later pleaded guilty to the previous murders to avoid the death penalty in Florida. Receiving 4 life sentences, he is still alive at the California healthcare facility. Charles Jackson. Born in 1937 in Louisiana, this guy is known as the East Bay Slayer, responsible for the murders of at least 7 women and 1 man between 1975 and 1982. 1 man between 1975 and 1982 in the San Francisco Bay Area. However, he was only convicted of a single murder but died in prison in 2002 before they could complete exposure of his crimes, based on DNA profiling. He is also suspected of committing several more murders. John Henry. John Henry was born in 1975 in Florida. John would murder his wife, go to jail, be paroled, 10 years later would promptly kill his second wife and her child. During his first crime, he stabbed his wife at a red light while their 2 kids were in the back and ran off into the woods. He was promptly arrested and sentenced to 15 years with a chance of parole. After serving half his time, he was released and married a 28-year-old store clerk named Suzanne, who had a child named Christian. Well, a few years after their marriage, Suzanne would stay at a woman's shelter because she was what John would do to her. After some time, she would return home because John would agree he would move out. However, on Christmas in 1985, Henry would come to her apartment and get himself inside and stab her multiple times. He would then do the same thing to Christian after taking him to a farm near the pasture. The same officer that caught Henry 10 years prior captured him again, and the following day after the murders, he was sentenced to death and was executed by lethal injection in 2014. Robert Rhodes. Born in Iowa in 1945, Robert was convicted of the first-degree murder of Regina K. Walters and was slated to be tried for 2 more times before charges were dropped due to the wishes of the victims' families. Rhodes is additionally suspected of torturing, raping, and killing more than 50 women between 1975 and 1990. Based on data about his truck routes and women who went missing during those years, and who met the profile of his preferred victims. At the time he was caught, Rhodes claimed to have engaged in these activities for 15 years. After being apprehended in 1990, he still remains behind bars in a correctional center. Jeffrey Cutlip. Born in 1949 in Oregon, Jeffrey would be a well-known sex offender and abductor in the early 70s and would serve time until around the 80s, when he would break into a woman's apartment and at the same apartment he lived at. He would attempt to rape her, but when that didn't work, he strangled her with the telephone cord and slept with her corpse. Though Jeffrey lived at this apartment complex, he was never questioned for this murder. Just 2 years later, he would lure a 15-year-old into a false sense of safety and would proceed to drown her and sleep with her corpse. Jeffrey did this again with another young child. Police were unable to link the cases together, however locals strongly believed Jeffrey had something to do with the crime. To the point he was basically shunned out of the town and he moved away. Jeffrey would never get captured or have a trial of these murders, and they would remain unsolved for almost 20 years, when, in 2012, Cutlip called the police from Texas and confessed to the 4 murders. They were unable to link one of them. Jeffrey was convicted of 3 counts of murder and is still alive to this day at a correctional institution. Robert Yates. Robert was born in 1952 in Washington, in a middle-class family that attended a local Seventh-day Adventist church. Before his birth, his grandmother had murdered his grandfather with an axe in 1945. Yates is known to have murdered at least 11 women in Spokane. Yates also confessed to 2 murders that had happened in a nearby city. His attacks lasted from 1975 to 1998, and may have killed more towards 17 women, but only convicted of 12. Yates was arrested in 2000 and is still alive to this day in Washington State Penitentiary.
David Berkowitz. Infamously known as the Son of Sam, Berkowitz was born Richard David Falco in 1951, Brooklyn, New York. His mother gave him up for adoption a few days after his birth, and his father was a married man. Richard was adopted by Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz. They lived in the Bronx, worked at a hardware store, were middle-aged and childless. Richard took up the name Berkowitz and started to be called David. David had a troubled childhood. He was smart enough to do well in school, but lost interest. His adoptive mother, Pearl, died from breast cancer and lived with his adoptive father throughout high school. David joined the Army in 1971 and was honorably discharged in 1974. In 1975, David would locate his biological mother, who told David about the details of his birth, which sent David into a calamity. His crime spree would begin on Christmas Eve the same year in Co-op City, where David attacked 2 women with a knife. One was stabbed 6 times and spent in the hospital for a week, but the 2 women survived. July 29th, 1976, David shot Donna Laurie and Jonah Valenti outside of Laurie's car. Laurie was killed, but Valenti survived. David would change his MO because on November 27th, David injured 2 high school students outside of their home, shooting them once with a .44 caliber revolver. They both survived. On January 30th, 1977, John Deal and his fiancée Christine Freed were attacked in Deal's car when they were fired at 3 times. Deal sped off uninjured, but Freed was hit twice and died later that day. There was no witnesses who made the shots. David would later shoot 19-year-old Virginia Voskalian while she was walking from her school in March 1977. She held her textbooks as cover, but the bullet managed to strike her in the head, killing her. 2 days later, the police injured a press conference on the murders. On April 17th, Alexander Isu and Valentina Suriani were shot in Isu's brother's vehicle. They both died hours later. David sent letters to the police referring to himself as the son of Sam. David would go forward to the shootings until July of 1977. He was captured the next month and confessed to the shootings. He pleaded guilty and is still alive in prison. Still alive today, he is a born-again Christian and is known to be a modeled prisoner.
Monty Rissell. Monty was born in 1958 in Kansas. By the age of 14, Monty would commit his first crime by sexually assaulting a neighbor and would be in and out of jail all the way until he was 17. He would murder an escort who lived at the same apartments he did, though he would never be charged for this crime. Exactly a year later, Monty would murder a McDonald's manager and leave her body in a parking lot to be found the following day. He would do this 3 more times to 3 more women in the span of just a year. Rissell was charged with abducting, raping, and murdering 5 women after his DNA was matched at every single crime scene. Monty was charged in life in prison and is still alive to this day at a correctional center. Edward Warren. Edward was born in 1953 in Oregon. Warren was convicted for the 1979 double murder of a couple in the same state and was initially sentenced to death. The sentence was later commuted to 2 life imprisonment terms, which he served until his death in 2003. 5 years later, he would be linked to an unsolved 1976 Portland murder case, which, at the time, was the oldest solved case in the state's history. In 2003, Warren died inside a Salem prison hospital from respiratory failure. Anthony Lorette. Anthony was born in 1951, though the location of his birth is highly speculated. Anthony was smart, but only in the criminal aspect, mostly because he was really good at covering his tracks and using different names to evade police for a long time. For instance, for his first murder, he would use his real name and stay at a hotel 3 miles away from a murder that would take place at another hotel, and he would use a different name. The following day from that crime, Anthony would quietly stalk an elderly woman back to her home before breaking in and stabbing her to death and leaving her body to be found. He would be meticulous like this throughout his crimes until his final victim. He would leave a witness who was able to pinpoint specific facial features on Anthony. What's crazy is that when Anthony was charged and in jail, his father attempted to pay off the police for an escape to let his son go. His father would be thrown in jail after this information was found out. Anthony would confess to almost 31 murders, and though he was only convicted of 1, somehow, Lorette was executed via lethal injection in 1995. Stephen Catlin. Stephen was born in 1944 in California. Stephen would be pretty much a bum and would never want to do any hard labor. He even attempted to forge signatures for checks for him when he was 19. However, things would take a turn for the worst as he got older. Stephen would marry, then divorce, then remarry, then divorce. Stephen would poison his last two wives and his own adoptive mother to kill them and retrieve money from their deaths. On December 23, 1985, Caitlin was charged in Kern County with the 1976 murder of Joyce Caitlin, his fourth wife, 1984 murder of Martha Caitlin, his mother. He is currently housed in San Quintina State Prison. James Grinder. Little is known about James, but he was born in 1945. He committed a triple homicide in 1977 in Arkansas. He picked up 3 girls, aged 13 to 14, after hitchhiking. He bought alcohol for them and drove them to a cemetery to drink in seclusion. He raped all 3 girls, strangling 2 and bludgeoning the other with a tire iron. He hid their bodies and went back home to tell his girlfriend what happened. A week later, he visited the bodies to hide them. 2 of the girls' skeletal remains were found in 1986, and the other was never found. James was suspected of murdering Julianne Helton in 1984 in Missouri. Helton had been stabbed and beaten to death after being raped. Her car was found abandoned, and a search party found her body in 1998. Her car was found abandoned, and a search party found her body. In 1998, James was arrested for burglary, and he confessed to the murder of Helton and the triple homicide of 1977. He pleaded guilty to all murders and died in prison in 2010. Ronald and James Alridge. Ronald Keith Alridge and James Vernon Alridge were 2 brothers who committed a murder in 1976. They went on a crime spree in 1985. Ronald was described as quiet, while James was described as outgoing and popular. Ronald robbed a department store, stealing several guns. He took these guns to school. On April 12, 1976, Ronald shot a classmate in the bathroom, killing him. Ronald was arrested and convicted of the murder. He was released in 1983 and got a job at a restaurant, but was fired less than a year later. Ronald and James started a robbery spree beginning in January of 1985. They robbed a pizza shop before Ronald fatally shot the pizza owner. In February, they drove to a convenience store where James worked. James knew where the safe codes were held. He was let in by 21-year-old Brian Clinton after asking to make a phone call. James left and Ronald scolded him for having cold feet. James went back to the store and forced his way in. James tied up Brandon before robbing the store and killing him execution style. Brian's mother drove in the parking lot to pick up her son, and Ronald and James fled. On March 25th, Ronald and James, along with 2 other accomplices, robbed a Whataburger. Ronald was armed with a shotgun and the 2 others with pistols. Ronald shot a girl who surrendered in the chest. One employee recognized the voice of Ronald and told this to police. Both brothers were arrested, and 2 accomplices of the previous robbery later testified against the brothers. Ronald confessed to another isolated murder. Both brothers were sentenced to death. Ronald was executed in 1995 and James in 2004, both by lethal injection. Edward Legrone. Edward was born on March 3, 1957 in Texas. Edward dropped out of high school in the 10th grade. In 1976, Edward murdered an acquaintance with a .38 caliber revolver after an argument erupted. He was charged and convicted of this murder. He was sentenced to 20 years but only served 7, being released in 1984. He found a job as a factory worker and met Pamela Lloyd. They started dating. He continued his criminal activities with robberies and raping teenagers in 1990 and 1991. Edward had been marrying Lloyd's 9-year-old daughter, getting her pregnant. Pamela and her family cut contact with him, who grew angry from this. Edward got his new girlfriend to buy him a shotgun. He traveled to Lloyd's home. An uncle opened the door and was shot but survived. Edward would murder Lloyd's 9-year-old daughter and her 2 great aunts, both elderly. The rest of the Lloyd family escaped and called the police while Edward fled the scene. He was arrested for the triple homicide, but he was also suspected of murdering 2 other people after dating one of the victim's daughters. But this has never been affirmed, and there's no insufficient evidence tying him to those murders. He was convicted and put to death in 2004 by lethal injection. Joe Methinley. Joe was born in 1955 in Maryland. Joe has described his childhood as poor and neglectful. His mother, however, provided for Joe and her 5 other children and worked double shifts as a waitress. Joe's father was an alcoholic and died in a car accident. Joe was known to be an intelligent student and polite. He joined the army after graduating high school. After joining, Joe got hooked on drugs, particularly heroin. He also grew more reserved from his family, rarely contacting them. By the 1990s, Joe became obese and homeless, but did have a steady job at a factory. In 1996, Joe killed Kimberly Spicer by stabbing her and hid her body at the factory site. A month later, he asked a friend to help bury the body, and the friend reported it to police. Joe was arrested and charged with the murder. He confessed to other murders, targeting white prostitutes, raping and killing them before burying them in a shallow grave. He was convicted of Spicer's murders and sentenced to death, but was commuted to life in prison. He died in 2017.
Warren Harris. Born in 1961 in New Orleans, little is known about Harris's early life, but his grandfather was a respected Baptist preacher. Harris dropped out in the 8th grade and began committing petty crimes. He later moved in with a transsexual man in the New Orleans French Quarter. Harris was incarcerated for stealing a car in 1974 and was released in 1975. At the age of 16, from February to April 1977, Warren Harris would stab 4 men, 3 of them gay, in what is known as the French Quarter stabber case. Harris attacked 5 men. 3 of them were in Harris's apartment. Harris stabbed each victim dozens of times. 1 victim was stabbed 50 times. 1 victim was attacked in a vacant lot but survived. Another victim was murdered inside his apartment. Most of the men were middle-aged or older and white. Harris was arrested for the murders after he attempted a robbery. He confessed to detectives about his animosity towards gay people and is said to have committed 4 murders. Detectives at first believed Harris was simply there at the murders but did not participate. Harris was charged with the murders, and in October 1977 his trial began, and Harris was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. Warren Harris was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences. He was not charged with one of the murders he confessed to. He remains in prison to this day.
Kenneth Bianchi and Angela Buono. The Hillside Stranglers is one of the most infamous serial killing cases. Originally thought to be one killer, turned out to be 2 cousins. Kenneth and his older cousin Angelo would go on to terrorize the city of LA for 5 months, killing 10 people and an additional 2 in Washington. Kenneth was described as docile, while Angelo was more confident. In 1976, Kenneth moved away from his city and to LA to move in with Angelo. Kenneth considered Angelo a strong role model. When Kenneth ran out of money, both men started a pimping service, tricking young women into prostituting themselves, but this proved to be unsteady income. In 1977, they would start their killing spree, with their MO would be kidnapping young prostitutes before moving up to middle-class women. The 2 men would tie them up before raping and strangling them to death. They would dump the bodies in the hillside of LA. The killing stopped in 1977. Kenneth had been going on police rides for some reason and picked up suspicion by police. Angelo threatened to kill him if he didn't move away. Kenneth moved to Washington in 77, where he got a job as a security guard. In 1979, Kenneth strangled 2 girls he lured in a house he was guarding. He was arrested and confessed to the murders. He confessed that he was with his cousin. Angelo was arrested a few months after. Both men were tried separately and convicted. Kenneth was sentenced to life without parole and died in 2002 of a heart attack, and Angelo was sentenced to life with parole due to him testifying against Kenneth. Angelo is still alive and will be eligible for parole in 2025.
Richard Trenton Chase. Known as the Vampire of Sacramento, Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1953. He was a bedwetter and became dependent on an alcohol as a toddler. He also liked to start fires and began mutilating animals, so he's ripe for a bright future. As he matured, he began taking hard drugs such as LSD that severely deepened his mental sickness. Chase had begun to cannibalize the animals he killed, eating them raw and drinking their blood. When Chase's roommates asked Chase to move out, he simply refused, and they moved out instead. Chase was institutionalized several times by his mother, where he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. In mid-1977, Chase was found in his truck with blood smeared all over him and his vehicle. There was also a bucket of blood in the passenger seat. It was determined to be cow's blood, and he was not charged with any crimes. Chase would commit his first murder on December 23, 1977, when, in a drive-by shooting, he killed 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin. He broke into the home of Teresa Wallen on January 23, 1978, with a butcher's knife. He buried her body and drank her blood. She was 3 weeks pregnant. 4 days later, he entered the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Marath. .22 revolver, he shot Miss Roth's friend, Danny Meredith, her 6-year-old son, Jason, and her 22-month-old nephew, David Feveria. He shot Evelyn and mutilated her body. Chase fled the scene after a visitor knocked on the door. He fled with Feveria's body. Chase left behind complete handprints and blood all over the house. This would lead to his arrest at his apartment, which was described as covered in blood. Richard Trenton Chase was sentenced to death for the murders in 1977, but committed suicide by overdose of prescription pills he had been saving, given to him by other prisoners in 1980.
William Hance. William was born in 1951 and is best being known for a soldier who is believed to have murdered 4 women in and around military bases before his arrest in 1978. He was convicted of murdering 3 of them and not brought to trial on the 4th. He was executed by the state of Georgia in the electric chair. Gary Lewington. Gary and his brother Thaddeus would be well known as serial brother killers. Thaddeus, the elder one, would be 4 years older. Nothing to note in their youth, besides their family life would be pretty normal. However, the duo would scheme to rob people and kill them and take their valuables. As a murder weapon, the criminals used .22 caliber pistols, due to which they received the nickname the .22 caliber killers. In 1979, both brothers were sentenced to several terms of life imprisonment. Thaddeus died in 1989, and Gary would die in 2004. Donald Miller. Donald was born in Michigan in 1954, who committed a series of 6 acts of murder in Michigan from 1977 to 1978, who committed a series of 6 attacks in Michigan from 1977 to 1978. 4 of these resulted in fatalities, to which Miller would later plead guilty and receive a lengthy prison sentence with a chance of parole. Donald is still alive to this day in a correctional facility in Michigan. Danny Barber. Danny was born in California in 1955, and in 1979 he would be arrested for killing and raping a woman named Janice after he would try to break into her home and fail at trying to robbing it. He would do this 2 more times in the span of 2 years, until his capture in 1980. Danny would remain calm through his trial and all the way until his execution. His last words were more of a last paragraph, due to its length. Danny died via lethal injection in 1999. Joseph Franklin. Joseph was born in 1950 in Alabama. Franklin was convicted of several murders and received 4 life sentences, as well as 2 death sentences. Joseph was a well-known white supremacist. His parents were probably role models with that as well. Much of his crimes would be acts of racism or sexism of some kind. Joseph would murder 7 black people and firebomb nearly 10 other homes. He would commit the murder usually with a pistol or some kind of firearm. In the late 1980s, however, he was pulled over with the unregistered firearm in his car, and he was brought in for interrogation. However, he would flee the interrogation, and this would give them enough evidence to search his whole car and his house. They found enough evidence to convict Joseph of 2 different accounts of murder, and possibly 4. Joseph was sentenced to death and was executed by lethal injection in November 2013. Laron Williams. Laron was born in 1949 in or around Tennessee. He is known for being convicted of killing a prostitute and escaping from prison, then proceeding to kill an officer on the run and then a priest just within a day of each other. He was captured and sentenced to death. However, he was killed by 2 fellow inmates in 1985. Martha Johnson. Yuck, this lady is terrible. Martha was born in Georgia in 1955. She would go on to marry 3 individuals and have a child with each, a daughter and a son, and another daughter respectively. Martha had an 11-year-old daughter who would die from asphyxia caused by Martha. However, in the preceding years between 1977 and 1981, Johnson's 3 other daughters all died. However, she would only be ever convicted of the first daughter's death. She was released on parole in 2020. Timothy Gressier. Being born in 1944 in Pennsylvania, Timothy would be abandoned by his father when he was just 1. His mother would meet a man named Bernie and took his last name. Timothy has confessed to killing 9 women, 5 in Missouri and 4 others in Illinois and Pennsylvania. After 20 years in 2007, Tim was finally connected to one of the murders, and once he was caught and cracked, he eventually confessed to the other ones. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison and is at a correctional center in Illinois. Roger Kibb. Roger was born in 1939 in California and is most well known as the I-5 Strangler. In 1991, he was sentenced to death for one of these crimes. However, back in 1988, he would murder another man and be sentenced to 25 years in prison. Once there, he would be murdered by a cellmate in 2021, just a couple of years before he was going to be released. James Cable. Being born in 1948 in Kentucky, I believe he has the largest sentence on our list. Being 300 years imprisonment, James murdered between 3 and at least 5 women and teenage girls in Kentucky between 1982 and 1990. All of which had occurred after he had been released from prison for a 1977 murder and rape. He was not linked to any of the killings until 2004. While he was in prison for a different crime, he died while awaiting trial for the murders in 2013. Lorenzo Gillard. Born in 1950 in Missouri, he would have aggressive behavior in his youth. He would physically assault smaller children, making him a bully. However, he ended up becoming a trash company supervisor. Gillard is believed to have raped and murdered at least 13 women and girls from 1977 to 1993. He was convicted of 6 counts of murder on March 16, 2007. The only reason he was arrested this late was because DNA evidence back then wasn't able to get him convicted, but a federal grant reopened cold cases, gave police enough evidence to get him, and he is still alive at the correctional center in Missouri.
Joseph Nasso. He was born in 1934 in New York and would be convicted of 4 murders, though it was believed that he had committed nearly 10 of them. Anything about his youth is immediately shadowed by his love life. He would marry a woman only to divorce her shortly after, then marry another woman and be with her for 18 years before they would have a falling out. After this, he would revisit his ex-wife and remarry her and also have a child with her. Though, around this time, around 1977, would be where he commit his first murder, usually by strangulation or just shooting them. Joseph was arrested in 2010, and a search of his home revealed a diary describing each of his late 70s crimes and early 80s murders. He is still alive to this day. He is just awaiting his execution on death row.
Donald Broadnax. Donald was born in 1961 in Alabama, had a normal youth life. However, when he was 16, he would begin arguing with his 19-year-old best friend, Greg. They would begin to argue, then scuffle, then Donald brandished a weapon and shot his friend to death. He would then be promptly arrested and sentenced for 99 years and a chance of parole after a few years. In 1986, he was allowed to go to be released. Everything was good. In 1994, he would marry a woman named Hector, and she would have a grandson named D'Angelo. These would be Donald's next two victims. A piece of Donald's clothing was found at the crime scene and decided to bury the two in separate places. As of August 2022, he remains on death row awaiting execution. Edward Edwards. This guy was born in Ohio and would be known to kill 5 people and even be on the FBI's most wanted list. His first crime would happen all the way in 1977 and wouldn't be arrested until 2011, when DNA evidence would put him at multiple different scenes of multiple different crimes. Edward was already in prison, though in 2009, for a completely different reason, he died of natural causes. Darrell Rich. Being born in 1955 in California, he would be known for murdering 3 women and an 11-year-old girl between June and August 1978. He was sentenced to death in California in 1981 for 2 of the murders and was executed in 2000 at San Quentin State Prison by lethal injection. Gerald Parker. Being born in 1955 in Phoenix, and a serial killer who raped and murdered 5 women in California, a sixth victim who was pregnant at the time of the attack survived, but her child was delivered stillborn. The crimes took place in 1978 and 1979, but Parker was not identified until the killer until 1996. Parker confessed to the murders and was sentenced to death in 1999 and is awaiting execution on death row in state prison. Alright, quick fast round. Andre Jones murdered a couple, then murdered 3 more people on the same day with Freddie Tiller. Joseph Toone murdered a family of 4 and 2 other women in Minnesota. Robert Willie murdered at least 3 people in Louisiana, executed in 1984. Mauricio Silvia, known as the Monster, killed an acquaintance as a teenager, paroled and went on to kill 2 teenage runaways and his half-sister and was sentenced to death. Vincent Groves raped and strangled prostitutes in Denver and the surrounding areas and died in prison. Jeffrey Dahmer. Being born in 1960, Jeffrey is responsible for murdering 16 people, men and boys. Essentially, he would use his charm. This is ironic because in his school life he was seen as an outcast and a weirdo. I guess for the right reasoning. Anyways, he would use his charm and lure them into a false sense of security. He would then kill them, but he wouldn't just do that. He would dismember the bodies and would cannibalize some parts, and for others, he would just hang them around his house. However, on his final victim, they would manage to escape and inform police of what Jeffrey was doing. This would lead to his arrest and conviction of 15 people out of the 16 he killed. Jeffrey was beaten to death by a fellow inmate in 1994. Thank you so much for watching. This took me about 70 man-hours to write. Figured we'd end on Jeffrey Dahmer because that's a good kind of end point. There will be a final part, but for that part 3, I will have everything finished, so this will be just a trilogy video. Thank you guys so much, and I will see you later. Bye.